that any act of violence is related to terror. And that, of course, is what the terrorists' organisations are trying to do, create an atmosphere of uncertainty, tension and friction between different communities. And of course, so a situation like this has been sealed and very calmly dealt with by the French police, partly to make sure that that the multiplier effect of the previous atrocities we've seen in France, that this doesn't add to that.
Okay. Sam, for now, thanks so much. Thanks a lot. Let's move on to other news for you now. And the Prime Minister says that she expects the police and MI5 to carry out a review of the response to the London terror attack. Theresa May has told Sky News that she recognises people's concerns following reports that the plotters slipped through the net. She's been speaking to our political editor, Faisal Islam.
MI5 and the police have already said after the Manchester attack that they would be looking and reviewing how they dealt with that. And I would expect them to do exactly the same in relation to London Bridge. What government needs to do, and what the government that comes in after Thursday's election needs to be willing to do, is to give more powers to the police and the security service when they need them, needs to deal with this issue of terrorism and extremism online, and also needs to be able to call out and deal with extremism here in the United Kingdom.
Well, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is standing by in Westminster for us now. Hello to you. John, what did you make of what she had to say?
Well, she's talking about three things. More powers for the police, and attention will inevitably focus there on whether control orders should be brought back. Now, that's easier said than done, as the Prime Minister has pointed out in recent days. Now, control orders were very tough orders which gave police extra powers of arrest, detention, restrictions on the movement of suspects and so on. They were chucked out by the courts back in 2010, 2011, and the coalition government brought in different measures known as TPIMs, different types of orders, which are not as strong. And there are those in Parliament who say, got to go back to some sort of control orders. Secondly, she's talking about sentences. Well, there's already a debate going on about how long you can detain terror suspects. At the moment it's 14 days. A lot of talk about it being put back up to 28 as it was before. There was a huge debate there under the Labour government as well. Mr Blair and Gordon Brown were Prime Minister. And then, of course, there's the internet crackdown, which PM's been talking about for ages. Nothing much has happened. She talked there about a review by the security services. We are bound to see, once the election's over, I would have thought, a pretty urgent inquiry. I guess the Home Affairs Select Committee of MPs, which was chaired in the run-up to the election by the Labour MP Yvette Cooper, they're bound to want to look at all this, and the whole question of police numbers and so on. And also the Intelligence and Security Committee, which has been chaired by the Conservative MP Dominic Grieve. So bound to be a lot once the election's over.
All right, everyone, we have lost that feed from Sky News. So what we're going to do now is take you to a live feed of the Senate floor. Stand by. We'll get that for you in just a moment. As promised, we're going to take you live now to the Senate floor.
And it certainly violated a fundamental principle important to the American people, that in this country we don't erase history. Now, this can be fixed. The CIA can get the report back. It can do what Senator Feinstein told the government to do back in 2014, which is to distribute this report, read it, learn from it. Will Director Pompeo get the report back on his own? There's no reason to think so. But if there's one thing Director Pompeo said again and again during his remarks through the confirmation process. Director Pompeo told the Senate Intelligence Committee repeatedly that he's going to rely on the advice of his lawyers. And that is exactly where Courtney Elwood comes in. What will her advice be to Director Pompeo? What will she advise him about whether to allow this attempt to erase history to stand, or whether it's going to get fixed and the report is going to be brought back? The Senate doesn't have any idea this morning. We do know that Ms. Elwood's responses to questions on the torture issue were troubling, and that we need to look at those responses in a whole new light based on what happened last week. Now, Ms. Elwood said that she read the unclassified executive summary of the torture report, but based on her responses to questions, the 500-page executive summary was not adequate for her, was not sufficient for her to conclude whether the CIA's interrogation techniques violated the law. So clearly, she needed to read the classified report. Ms. Elwood, in both her written answers and at her hearing, said that she would read the classified report. But now, because of what the current chair of the Intelligence Committee and the director of the CIA have done, it's not going to be available. It's not going to be available for her to read. Now, many members of this body have spoken out about the torture report and the need for its lessons to be learned so this country never again engages in the kind of illegal, damaging program that Senator Feinstein has documented. But now there is an issue that goes beyond what the Senate has thought this issue was all about. Now there is an individual nominee for whom these lessons are critical. This nominee told our committee that she had not yet studied whether the CIA's torture techniques were legal. She told us that she would read the report, and now the report is gone. What could be more troubling than that? What is at issue here is one of the most disturbing and undemocratic events to ever take place in the United States Senate. The current chair of the Intelligence Committee has told the executive branch to get rid of its copies of the report, and at least some of the agencies have sent their only copies to the committee. So I'm going to be clear, the current chair does not have the authority to do this. First, in December of 2014, the full final classified report was filed as a Senate report. It is therefore not a committee document. Second, no one can retroactively change the status of a historical Senate report. The report was finalized, filed, transmitted to the executive branch during the 113th Congress. Only in the 114th Congress did the current chair assume the chairmanship and begin to assert control over the report. So think about the implications here. How can this body allow members of Congress who don't like what a previous Congress has done to unilaterally try to erase history? How many other congressional reports would be at risk? There are other reports that have not yet been fully declassified. Should the Senate worry about whether or not they'll be protected? Should Americans be concerned that the country's historical records are going to be erased before the public ever sees them? My view is the effort by the current chair of the committee is an assault on one of the fundamental values of our democracy. That in this country, you don't eradicate a historical record just because you find it uncomfortable. Now, there's a reason why insecure dictators do it. And there's a reason why this kind of thing has never happened here. because we are a confident democracy that's always looked to our own history and all our flaws as we seek to build a better nation, we're better than this. I urge my colleagues to defend these principles. I urge them to vote against this nomination. I yield back.
Mr. President,
The senator from Arkansas.
I want to add my support this morning for Courtney Elwood as the next general counsel of the CIA, not that she really needs it. In her many years of public service and private practice, Courtney has earned the esteem of her colleagues across both parties and two administrations. David Criss, an Obama appointee, calls her a first-class lawyer. Ben Powell, a Bush appointee, calls her one of the finest lawyers of her generation. Caroline Krass, another Obama appointee, calls her an excellent choice. And Juan Kim, another Bush appointee, says she's careful, brilliant, and highly accomplished. In other words, you don't need me to tell you Courtney Elwood is a first-rate attorney. In fact, you don't need anyone to tell you that because her accomplishments speak for themselves. She graduated from Yale Law in 1994 and went on to clerk for both Judge Mike Ludig on the Fourth Circuit and then Chief Justice William Rehnquist at the Supreme Court. After spending some time in private practice, she worked for 6 years in the George W. Bush administration, rising from associate counsel to the president, to deputy counsel to the vice president, to deputy chief of staff and counselor to the attorney general. We're not talking about a rookie lawyer here who's unexperienced in the ways of Washington or in the corridors of power. And her commitment to the law is unquestioned and unquestionable. And that's just the person we need for this position. The General Counsel of the CIA will help Director Pompeo navigate the many twists and turns of the thorny legal terrain as our intelligence community defends our country against a wide range of threats: terrorism, cyber warfare, and good old-fashioned espionage. We need people of the highest caliber serving at our national security agencies. And there's broad agreement that Courtney Elwood fits the bill. I'm happy to support her nomination. I want to thank her and her family for answering the call to serve once again. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following remarks be entered in a separate part of the journal.
Without objection.
The attacks in London last weekend exposed, in a matter of minutes, just how vulnerable our free societies truly are. All it takes is a van or a knife and an unsuspecting bystander to turn a fun night out on the town into a horrific nightmare. Of course, we shouldn't need any reminders, but let me give one yet again. We are at war with Islamic extremists. We have been for years, and I'm sorry to say, there's no end in sight. It's easy to forget this as we go about our daily lives, but our enemies have not and they will not. They've never taken their eyes off the ultimate target either, the United States. Yes, we're at war with a vicious and unyielding foe, and just as our enemy can attack us with the simplest of everyday tools, the strongest shield we have in our defense is just as basic. It is the intelligence information of knowing who is talking to whom about what, where, when, and why. After the 9/11 attacks, our national security agencies developed cutting-edge programs that allowed us to figure out what the bad guys are up to and stop them before they could perpetrate such heinous attacks. Very often, the intelligence they've collected has made the difference between life and death for American citizens. But one of those programs is going to sunset later this year. I'm talking about Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This is a program that collects information about foreign persons on foreign soil, and as a result, saves American lives. Unfortunately, this and other programs were distorted in the public debate by a traitor, disgruntled ex-NSA contractor Edward Snowden, who now sits in the warm embrace of Russian intelligence services. And ever since his very damaging leak of classified material a few years back, many Americans have grown doubtful about these programs. and Section 702 in particular. Which is why it bears repeating just what Section 702 does. It allows our national security agencies to collect internet or phone communications from a source within the United States, like an internet service provider, but only under a very specific set of conditions. It cannot target American citizens, not even lawful permanent residents. It can't even target foreigners communicating on U.S. soil. And it can only target people discussing a specific list of topics pre-approved by the FISA court, which is made up of federal judges with life tenure. And we're not talking about what they're picking up at the grocery store or checking in on the kids. We're talking about things like weapons of mass destruction. It's true that this program occasionally does collect information about American citizens, and that will be true of any attempt to stop any kind of homegrown terrorism. But if you're concerned about protecting Americans' privacy rights, then you should support extending Section 702. It puts in place a host of privacy protections to scrub raw intelligence of any unnecessary identifying information. To allow this program to expire on December 31st would hurt both our national security and our privacy rights. That's why today I'm introducing a bill that would reauthorize Section 702 permanently, as is, with no changes. We can't tie the hands of our national security officials at the precise moment that our enemies are taking the gloves off around the world. Terrorists don't plan to sunset their threats to our way of life. So why should our important counterterrorism tools sunset? I'm glad to say my legislation has the support of every Republican senator on the Intelligence Committee, and I look forward to earning the support of my colleagues in the weeks ahead, because we can't afford to let this program expire. It is not too much, and it is not an exaggeration to say that American lives depend on Section 702. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The senator from Louisiana.
are we in quorum call?
We are.
May I ask that the quorum call be vitiated?
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I'm here to speak about a topic which wherever I go, people speak about, which is the replacement of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as people know it to be, know it by its name, if you will. And clearly we need action. I had a Facebook post from maybe a week or two ago from Brian in Covington, Louisiana. And he said, my family plan is $1,700. And the quote goes on to say how his family cannot afford that $1,700. Rates are going up. I've said time and time again, my friend back in Baton Rouge, who he and his wife, 60 and 61, their quote for their insurance last year was $39,000 for 1 year. Clearly not affordable. And this is not just in Louisiana, it's in Washington, D.C., it's in California, it's across our nation where individual market quotes are going up where they cannot support. Now, most recently, Connecticut insurers are proposing rate increases that are 15.2 and 33.8 on average, respectively. In Oregon, they are quoting quotes 22% over 2017, and in Maryland, some insurers are going to raise rates as much as 59% for those individual plans. Now, I'm a physician. I've learned a couple things in my 20 or 30 years of practice. One, the lower cost, the patient must have the power, but two, the insurance must be affordable, and three, that the insurance they receive must be adequate. Now, President Trump totally got this. On the campaign trail, President Trump said time and again what I call his contract with the voter. He wanted folks to maintain coverage with lower premiums, caring for those with pre-existing conditions, and eliminating mandates. And I think President Trump just knew it. I've shorthanded this, if you will, saying that if we focus on lowering premiums and making sure that it passes the Jimmy Kimmel test, as the late-night comedian, when his child was born with a terrible heart problem, immediately got the care that child needed. So if we can have insurance that passes the Jimmy Kimmel test, lowering premiums, taking care of the rest of President Trump's goals, then I think that we can accomplish it. Now, we need to talk to experts, actuaries, those that design insurance plans to make sure we come up with something. But there's something else the president said that I want to focus on. This is just before he took the oath of office. He said people covered under the law, meaning the Affordable Care Act, the Republican replacement, can expect to have great health care. It'll be much simplified. One of the complaints about the Affordable Care Act, it's so complicated. To even log on, 16 pages online with your W-2, if you don't get it, you get booted out. The president said we must have a much simpler way of going about this, much less expensive and much better. Now, what could this look like? Let me propose some conservative solutions that could be in a Republican plan that would achieve the president's goal. First, the patient has to have the power. In my 30 years of practice, I found that if the patient has the power, the system lines up to serve her. One example is price transparency. If we can put in that a provider has to publish the provider's price so that the patient getting the blood test knows the cost of the blood test at that moment and can compare it to someone down the street, we will lower cost. One example just came up in a newspaper out of New Orleans, NOLA.com is their website. A woman went in, got blood test, received a bill weeks later, and her bill was for like $324. She found she could have gotten the same blood test for $34 right down the street. A woman from Texas came up, she said she had heard me speak of price transparency, the power of negotiating, if you will. The doctor ordered an MRI on her son's shoulder. And she calls up the different places she can have it done, and she gets a price, $667. It's on my Facebook page. She's a little video of her speaking. I got it for $667. Then I remember what you said, that if you pay cash, you get a discount. I called them back. I said, if I pay you cash, will you give me a lower price? They said, oh, pay us cash. We'll cut that $667 to $400. The patient had the power, and so she ended up paying far less for the procedure the doctor ordered. Now, that's one conservative solution. Give the patient the power. Secondly, let states innovate. We need to take all this power that Obamacare brought to Washington, D.C., and push it back out to the states. If we do that, we're going to accomplish something. And let's just acknowledge, there's 700,000 people or so in Alaska, and if you took the state of Alaska and you overlaid if you took a map of the state of Alaska and you put it over the lower 48, it would stretch from roughly Georgia to the Pacific Ocean. Washington, D.C. has almost the same population as Alaska, and you can walk across the city in a morning. Clearly, you need different solutions for an area you can walk across and an area that you cannot fly across in the same time that you'd walk across Washington, D.C. We have to return power back to the stations. We have to engage doctors and patients so that those patients with complex conditions get their health care managed. I use the example. Take a diabetic. She perhaps developed childhood diabetes. Now she's 35 years old. If a doctor is managing her condition, she works, stays at home, her complications are minimal, her life is much better. If her condition is not managed, she comes to the emergency room 3 times a month with diabetes out of control. That just shoots a hole in the bucket of fiscal responsibility and also in her health. And instead of working, keeping a family, instead she's coming to the hospital, getting care through the emergency room, which she cannot afford to pay for, and that cost is shifted to everyone else. That is not the way to manage that. We need to engage doctors with patients. Another conservative solution, we need more competition between insurers so that there's not just one insurance company in a market who can therefore set prices, but rather we have multiple. So if we give the patient the power, by giving the patient a credit, a tax credit, that she can use to purchase the insurance she wishes to have, that will create competition as more insurers enter the market. And if we have that competition, those market forces, prices come down. Now there's one more thing. When the president said we have to make things simpler, I think that also includes how we enroll people in insurance. We figured that out on Medicare. Under Medicare, if someone turns 65, they're on Medicare. It could not be simpler. They get a letter, they're on Medicare. If they don't want to, they can call, hey, I don't want to be on Medicare. But as a rule, they're on Medicare. Fortune 500 companies have figured out the same thing. In order to enroll people into retirement plans, they say, listen, you're in the 401k plan unless you choose not to be. And by making it simpler, they get 95% enrollment in retirement plans. Now, you could say, hey, listen, you got to fill out a bunch of forms, and if you don't fill out these forms, you're not going to be enrolled. But that would not work for Medicare. It would not work for 401ks. It has not worked under Obamacare. We need to take those same sort of solutions we found for both Medicare and enrolling people in their retirement and do it for the Republican alternative. The Republican alternative would say, we make it easy to enroll. You're in unless you're out. So if you're eligible for a tax credit, you would receive it. You would then have the insurance. If you were passive about it, you'd have a default policy. But if you were active, you could do more with it. But by doing so, you actually increase the number of people insured. Now, when you increase the pool of those insured, you lower premiums. We have Blue Cross look at our proposal to make it easy to enroll. You're in unless you're out. That would lower premiums by 20% just by expanding the number of those who were insured. 20%. So when President Trump says he wants to continue coverage, caring for those with pre-existing conditions without mandates, and lowering premiums, doing this feature where you are in unless you call us and tell us you don't want to be, making it simple achieves all 4 goals. We would increase coverage. By that, we would lower premiums, taking care of those taking care of those with pre-existing conditions. And again, using the mechanism that is already used in Medicare and in Fortune 500 companies, making it easy to enroll. There are some who don't want to give states the options, don't want to give patients the options, don't want to make it simple to enroll. They want to replace, if you will, the tyranny of Obamacare, where all this power was taken to Washington, D.C., and states and people were told what they had to do, with a different sort of tyranny, telling states what they can't do. I think we ought to give as much power to the states, as much latitude for the patients to come up with the solutions that work for them. That is the conservative way to go. But I will say, I'm speaking as a conservative, I very much invite our Democratic colleagues to come to the table. There are some of my Democratic colleagues that have said they just want Republicans to work through this and thinking that it might be a political train wreck, that it would work for their advantage. But in those states, there are Americans whose premiums are becoming unaffordable. I mentioned earlier, in Connecticut, premiums rising 15% and 34% this year. In Oregon, as high as 22%. Maryland, as high as 60%. Now, who cares if the person is a Democrat or a Republican? If her premium is increasing 60%, she cannot afford it. So I challenge my Democratic colleagues to get off the sidelines, engage, try and do something not for political purposes, but for the purpose of that person who's at home struggling to pay the bills and deciding that she can no longer to afford insurance, but perhaps unbeknownst to her, she has a cancer brewing inside her. And just when she decides she can no longer afford coverage because premiums have risen 60%, that is when her cancer is discovered. We have to address this, and it will take us on either side of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, to work together. I'll finish with a quote from the fellow from Covington. Brian, on my Facebook page, recall I said him saying that his family plan is $1,700 a month for he, his wife, his 2 children. The ACA, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, has brought him to his knees. I hope we can get something done. The middle class is dwindling away. Can everyone just come together and figure this out? This is a cry for help. It is a challenge to Republicans and Democrats to come up with a plan which is not a red plan or a blue plan, but an American plan to address his needs, his wife's needs, and those similar to him across the country. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back. I ask unanimous consent that Patrick Flanagan, an intern in Senator Kennedy's office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the day.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I yield back. And note my colleague from Louisiana to my right.
Anna.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Cassidy. You know, we just came back, as we all know, from the Memorial Day recess, and I wanted today to not only reflect on that, but also reflect on our anniversary of D-Day and the day that our allies invaded France in 1944. And in doing so today, Mr. President, I'd like to speak and pay tribute to all of those, including but not limited to Americans, but especially Americans who risked their lives to defend our freedoms. And in particular, Mr. President, I come today to recognize a special group of dedicated soldiers. You probably haven't heard of them, but they're referred to as the Ghost Army. The Ghost Army. This is a unit that served in World War II. It was comprised of the 23rd Special Headquarters Troops and the 3133rd Signal Service Company. The personnel of this U.S. Army unit were handpicked. They were handpicked for their artistic and creative characteristics, and you'll see why, Mr. President, in just a moment. They handled top secret information, and they were among some of America's most promising artists, engineers, and signals professionals. And their mission, the Ghost Army, their mission was very simple: fool Adolf Hitler. Fool Adolf Hitler using what was called tactical deception. The Ghost Army's deceptive creation of fake battles, inflatable tanks, theatrical props, and other inventive equipment falsified troop movements and had our enemies chasing ghosts, hence the name, the Ghost Army. Beginning in Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day and ending in the Rhine River Valley, the Ghost Army, Mr. President, staged over 20 fake battles, fake battlefield deceptions. The German army didn't know whether they were coming or going, thanks to the Ghost Army. These performances, of course, were illusions. They were called illusions by the soldiers, and they occurred in the most dangerous spot in the war, on the front line of battle. Now, without the Ghost Army's dedication and fearless perseverance, Allied successes at the Battle of the Bulge and the final battles in Po Valley, Italy, would not have been possible. The 23rd Unit was composed of only 1,184 men, 1,200 men. They put themselves at risk every day at the forefront of danger, and they fought tirelessly. They used ingenious, innovative methods to mislead the enemy, ultimately leading the Allies to many victories in Europe. Because of their bravery, because of the bravery of the 1,200 men in the Ghost Army, up to 30,000 American soldiers and 10,000 German soldiers were able to return home alive. So why are we waiting until today to honor these 1,184 brave Americans? Because until recently, the Ghost Army's mission was classified. It was top secret. Nobody except the members of the Ghost Army knew anything about it. And this has finally changed. And that's one of the reasons that I'm here today, Mr. President. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the Ghost Army Soldier Bill, a bipartisan effort led by Senators Markey, Collins, and King, and this long overdue legislation will award a Congressional Gold Medal to the 23rd Special Headquarters Troops and the 3133rd Signal Service Company. It's a privilege, Mr. President, to share that in my home state of Louisiana, the Ghost Army is being recognized at the New Orleans Museum of Art. Soldiers' art is on display, depicting many watercolor portraits as well as graphite portraits of civilians, soldiers, refugees during World War II. It's a legacy that our great state now gets to honor. And specifically, Mr. President, I want to recognize 6 brave men from Louisiana, my state, who were members of the Ghost Army. Hilton Howell Rayleigh of New Orleans, prominent journalist, the author of Touched with Madness. He recruited several of the hand-picked 23rd. Mr. Rayleigh trained and deployed the 3133rd Signal Service Company, which served in Italy. Also, Mr. Murphy P. Martin of St. Martinville, Louisiana. Mr. Thomas L. Raggio of Lake Charles, Louisiana. Mr. Roy L. Ravia of Calcasieu Parish in my state. Mr. Alvin J. Picard of Vermilion Parish. And last, but certainly not least, Mr. Anderson B. Wilson of Slidell, Louisiana. Unfortunately, Mr. Wilson is the only Ghost Army soldier still alive in Louisiana. I had the rare privilege and the rare honor of speaking with Mr. Wilson this morning. In December of 1943, President Roosevelt authorized the Ghost Army unit. Only 2 weeks later, in January 1944, Mr. Wilson was on his way to Camp McMorris, Tennessee, to join the Ghost Army. Who says the federal government can't move quickly when it wants to? Mr. Wilson trained there until May, when his unit was shipped out of New York to Liverpool, England. It was the largest convoy that at the time had ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean. From there, Mr. Wilson and his team traveled more than any other unit. From England, they went to France, they went to Belgium, they went to Holland, they went to Luxembourg, and they went to Germany. Mr. Wilson and his comrades fought fearlessly through the war's end, members of the Ghost Army. In July 1945, Mr. Wilson finally came home. However, while he came home safely, he couldn't even disclose, he couldn't even talk about, even to his own family, the honorable service unit that he was a part of. Now that's humbling to me, to hear a man sacrifice, to go through what he went through and not even be able to talk about it to his family. But he kept his word out of honor to his country. The willingness of Mr. Wilson and his fellow soldiers to risk their own lives to defend the freedom we have today, well, it too is humbling. Mr. Wilson returned home in 1945, and I hope he's listening right now. He's been a little under the weather. He was in the hospital when I spoke to him today. It wasn't until the 1990s, when Mr. Wilson was married with 2 grown children, that he could ever talk about his service to this great country, to share his stories, to share his experiences, to share his fight, to keep the freedoms that all of us take for granted every day. Mr. Wilson's story only gives a snapshot of the sacrifices and honorable work that these men of the Ghost Army gave to the Allied forces' victory. And I, for one, and I know all Americans join me in thanking them for their service and for the freedoms that they protected. I am proud of this Ghost Army legislation, and I hope to see it move forward and pass so that these fine Americans can receive the recognition, Mr. President, that they have long deserved. God bless the members of the Ghost Army, and if you're listening, Mr. Wilson, God bless you. Mr. President, I suggest Pardon me, Mr. President. I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
And Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate recess until 2:15 p.m.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
All right, everyone, the Senate is now in recess for about 2 hours and 15 minutes. I want to go ahead and give you guys a live look at the White House. I'm going to get your next feed ready for you in just a moment. Stand by. All right, everyone. The Department of Homeland Security is discussing the fiscal year 2018 budget request, and Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly is testifying at this hearing, so we're going to take you there now. Let's watch.
No, that injunction really has inhibited your efforts. I think the ranking member may want to jump into this, but can you explain in greater detail how that injunction is hampering your efforts of moving forward in terms of how do we properly vet refugees and other people coming in from those countries?
Yes, sir. We're just being as conservative as we can be, so that don't, and frankly, with due respect to the Congress, I get an awful lot of phone calls and an awful lot of ugly phone calls about how I'm not following some law. I learned very early on, if there's a perception that we're not executing the law, then a lot of people get agitated and call. That said, we have moved forward, as I mentioned a little earlier, the State Department, some enhanced questions and et cetera, in terms of the normal visa process. In my case, looking very, very hard. And some of this is, by the way, a cultural change. Whether it's my people at CSIS or the consular people, we are changing the culture to reflect the reality of security. That is to say, rather than the idea being bring in as many refugees as you can to meet some number set by the last administration, or bring in as many visas as you can, we actually now are changing the culture to say, look, if you want to come to America, you convince me you are who you are, and you're coming here for a period of time, and then you'll go home, and you won't do anything wrong when you're here. And, in the case of refugees, same thing. I know you're a refugee, but you got to prove to me who you are, and that you will come to the United States for all the right reasons. And ultimately, if you stay, then you'll assimilate into our society. But the kind of things, I think, the studies worldwide and the studies throughout the regions about what's the best way to do this, I think I'm restricted in that. But it doesn't mean we're not thinking about it.
From my standpoint, I don't want to feel you constrained. I don't want you restricted. Maybe Senator McCaskill's the same way. Maybe we can at least lend that support from 2 U.S. senators.
Yeah, and I've looked briefly at the decisions, Secretary, and I don't see. I know the State Department's moving forward in terms of trying to prepare a report. And so clearly their lawyers are not seeing what your lawyers are seeing. So, and specifically in a couple of the orders, it's clear that you're not restricted in terms of moving forward, which with what I think your job is, regardless of a request by the executive to pause. I mean, really what this appeal is about is whether or not he has the right under the executive order to say certain people cannot come here during a period of time that you are preparing underlying policies. I can't imagine anybody is going to argue with you about the fact that you should be preparing policies that will keep this country safe. And we've now been paused. I mean, there's been plenty of time that was envisioned in the executive orders for those policies to be done. So I would love further conversation with your lawyers that are telling you that you can't begin to give us more clarity about what the extra vetting is going to be.
So let's look on a bipartisan basis, working with the department to make sure that they're not restrained so they can move forward with that.
Yeah,
okay.
we'd be glad to work with you on that.
At the risk of running through too much of a list here, we are doing some things. The examples I would give you is enhanced automated screening by USIS, enhanced interviews, enhanced biometrics integration, enhanced data collection. So we are doing some things.
That's great.
And I could go on if you want, but there are more things.
Yeah, well,
here.
we can follow up together.
Let's work together on this and make
So
sure
we haven't stopped. We're just being very, as I say, very, very cautious about not getting out in front of the courts. That I'll genuflect to every day.
But if you've done it, then the whole case is moot.
Right.
And we could, the president could move on and tweet about something else.
So again, let's great committee, bipartisanship. Let's work together and make sure that you can do your job. Again, Secretary Kelly, I think from every member of this committee, thank you for your service. It's not a job I envy, but thank you for doing it, and to all the members of your staff and the department. This hearing record will remain open for 15 days until June 21st at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.
All right, everyone. Well, that was the end of that Department of Homeland Security budget hearing. I'm going to go ahead and rewind it so we can watch some of it from earlier.
A lack of enforcement of our immigration laws has been a huge incentive for people coming to this country. Under the new administration, under new secretary, we've obviously committed to securing our border. And I was a little concerned when people were taking credit for this reduction. I think after 3 months, we'll see what happens after 4 months. I think just that signal alone, that we're committed to securing this border and we're going to enforce our laws, has had a powerful effect, and I think we're seeing the results of it right now. So, again, I commend the Secretary for standing strong against severe criticism and actually enforcing the laws of this nation. With that, I'll turn it over to our ranking member, Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Kelly, for being here. You appeared before this committee a couple of months ago for the first time after being confirmed. And just look at the developments that have occurred in the few months since then, where you have had to be all hands on deck for serious issues facing the national and homeland security. On May 11th, you met with the airline industry executives about your concern about large electronic bans in terms of international travel. On May 12th, we had a ransomware cyber attack that struck more than 200,000 computers in 150 countries, shutting down auto production in France, police departments in India, and closing doctors' offices in Britain. And then, of course, tragically, on May 22nd, a terrorist suicide bomber killed 22 innocent children and adults in Manchester, England, and then this past weekend, terrorists killed 7 in London. These are just a few examples of why we are counting on you and why we respect the job that you have to do every day and how difficult it truly is. The importance of your work also speaks to the critical responsibility this committee has in providing oversight. I've never, ever, ever known of a government agency that worked better with less oversight. Asking hard questions is, of course, the way you do aggressive oversight, and I'm really particularly pleased that you're not afraid to answer tough questions. It's kind of who you are. You've been that way throughout your career. In fact, I noticed in the speech you gave to the Coast Guard's cadets, I'll quote you here, "Tell the truth to your seniors even though it's uncomfortable, even though they may not want to hear it. They deserve that. Tell the truth." I know that you will continue to speak truth to power, and I look forward to your honest assessment of what we can do to help you in that regard. While none of the 3 terrorists who did the attack over this past weekend would have been impacted by the President's proposed travel ban, a lot of discussion in the United Kingdom is now about the government, the Conservative Party's cuts in police resources over the last decade, and how many fewer resources there were actually on the ground to try to prevent those terrorist attacks. I'm concerned that the President's budget plans to cut critical TSA programs at a time that we cannot afford to let up on these security measures. A large portion of this cut is taken from the VIPER teams, the Visible Intermodal Prevention and Response teams, which are deployed all over the country to provide critical assistance with securing airports, subways, and bus terminals, some of the most attractive soft targets for terrorists in our country. The President's budget aims to cut the VIPER teams from 31 down to just 8 teams to cover the entire country. The Urban Area Security Initiatives, which has been a lifeline for major urban areas that have so many soft targets because of the large populations, those also have been cut. Additionally, the President's budget is going to completely eliminate the Law Enforcement Officer Reimbursement Program, which provides assistance to local law enforcement agencies who help secure our airports. Hundreds of airports across the country take part in this program, and particularly for smaller airports, this assistance is critically important. The President's budget will also slash other DHS programs that provide critical security to our transportation systems. The Transit Security Grant Program will be cut in half. The Port Security Grant Program will be cut in half. The President is calling for a complete elimination of the Complex Coordinated Terrorist Attacks Grant Program. I'm concerned that these priorities are not getting the attention they deserve, especially in light of what's going on around the world. I think we may be focused on a shiny object, which has come to be known as the travel ban, when instead we need to be focused on how many people we have, in your terminology, General, boots on the ground in terms of being able to identify, track, and prevent these terrorist attacks. We're being asked to fund additional Border Patrol agents and Air and Marine officers, but there's no provision in the budget for additional CBP officers. And the difference in terminology is very important because, as you know, Secretary Kelly, the majority of drugs and other contraband come through our country through the ports of entry, and the CBP officers are the ones responsible for finding them and stopping them. We cannot neglect our ports of entry as we try to increase resources in terms of Border Patrol and ICE agents. So I'm glad you're here today, Secretary Kelly. There are a lot of important issues before us. I have a lot of questions. I know the rest of the committee does too. And I can't tell you how much it means to all of us that you're willing to come here, to both Democrats and Republicans, and answer our questions. I hope the rest of the administration follows your example because I think you're setting a very good one.
Thanks, Senator McCaskill. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in our witnesses, so if you please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Secretary John F. Kelly is the 5th Secretary.
Important issues before us. I have a lot of questions. I know the rest of the committee does too. And I can't tell you how much it means to all of us that you're willing to come here, to both Democrats and Republicans, and answer our questions. I hope the rest of the administration follows your example because I think you're setting a very good one.
Thanks, Senator McCaskill. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in our witnesses, so if you please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Secretary John F. Kelly is the 5th Secretary of Homeland Security. Prior to joining DHS, General Kelly served as commander of the U.S. Southern Command, where he worked closely with U.S. law enforcement and DHS personnel in a coordinated effort to combat the flow of drugs, people, and other threats against the homeland into the United States from across the southern border. Secretary Kelly's career has included extensive service in the Marine Corps, where he commanded Marine Forces Reserve and Marine Forces North, and served as senior military assistant to 2 Secretaries of Defense, Secretaries Gates and Secretary Panetta. Less than a year after his retirement from service, Secretary Kelly returned to serve the American people as Secretary of Homeland Security. General Kelly is a retired 4-star general, a Gold Star parent. America could not be more appreciative and more fortunate to have you serving in this capacity, and we thank you for your service and look forward to your testimony.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, and distinguished members of the committee, every day the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security protect Americans from the threats we face. And so it is a great pleasure to appear before you today to talk about the tremendous men and women of the department and the critical missions they carry out in service of our America every day and night, 24/7, 365. I believe, as anyone who fully understands the fundamental role of our government also believes, that the federal government's responsibility every day begins and ends with the protection of the homeland and the security of our people. No other mission is as important, no other consideration more pressing, none. The President's fiscal year 2018 budget request for the Department will make it possible for us to continue and expand in many ways on our ability to protect our nation and its people. The world is a different place today. We can no longer think in terms of defense over there, but rather must think in terms of the security overall of the homeland across the numerous domains of potential attack and defense. The Department of Homeland Security is making a difference in fighting the home game while the Department of Defense fights the away game. And together with and because of the dedication and effective interagency integration with the DNI, CIA, NCTC, FBI, NSA, DEA, ATF, and over 1 million state and local and tribal enforcement professionals, America today is safe, secure, and prepared in a way that most could not have envisioned the day before 9/11. But the plots to attack the nation are numerous, the perpetrator's relentless. But we need a fully funded budget that matches our mission, no more continuing resolutions, and I think this budget does that. The President's FY 2018 budget requests $44.1 billion in net discretionary funding for the Department of Homeland Security. It also requests $7.4 billion to finance the cost of emergencies and major disasters and FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund. When you're talking about numbers like these, it's easy to lose sight of what's behind each dollar. But when you get right down to it, behind each and every dollar are hardworking men and women who have dedicated their careers and in many ways risked their lives to protect the American people. Every dollar invested in the men and women of DHS and every dollar invested in the tools, infrastructure, equipment, and training they need to get the job done is an investment in prosperity, freedom, and the rule of law. Above all, it is investment in the security of the American people. As far as I am concerned, recent events show you cannot invest too much in security. The terrorist attacks on innocent civilians in Kabul, Cairo, South Asia, Manchester, and now London are horrific reminders of the dangers we face globally. They also illustrate the need to do everything we can to keep our people safe. That means getting better about verifying identity, making sure people who are who they say they are, and working with our international partners to raise their awareness and raise their defenses, and force them to do so if need be, to at least operate at the levels that we work at. Domestically, one of the most important enhancements to this effort is the Real ID Initiative, an enhancement passed into law 12 years ago by the United States Congress, one which most of our states and territories have taken seriously and have already adopted. Many others are working hard at compliance. In those 12 years, some elected or appointed state and federal positions who have the fundamental and sacred responsibility to safeguard the nation have chosen to drag their feet or even ignore the law passed by Congress. I will not. Real ID will make Americans safer. It already is. Real ID will soon be enforced at our airports, land ports of entry, and all federal facilities. And it is a critically important 9/11 Commission recommendation that others have been willing to ignore, but which I will ensure is implemented on schedule with no extension for states that are not taking the effort seriously. For those states and territories that cannot or will not make the January 2018 deadline, they should encourage now their citizens to acquire other forms of ID compliant with the Real ID law, like passports, available, of course, from the State Department. We need to prevent bad actors, regardless of religion, race, or nationality, from entering our country. In recent years, we have witnessed an unprecedented spike in terrorist travel. There are more terrorist hotspots and foot soldiers now than almost any time in modern history. In Syria and Iraq, for instance, we have thousands of jihadist fighters that have converged from more than 120 countries. As our superb military machine, acting in coalition with and leading many other like-minded partners, as they succeed on the battlefield in the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, these jihadi fighters are returning home to Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, and even the Western Hemisphere. And who knows what they're up to, but we can guess. They are heading to what they think are safe havens to continue their plotting and otherwise advance their toxic ideology of hate, death, and intolerance wherever they are allowed to hide. We expect that some will look to travel to the United States to carry out attacks. With this context in mind, the President has issued clear direction in the form of an executive order to the entire executive branch to prevent the entry of aliens who seek to do us harm. But the current court injunction, of course, prevents us from taking steps right now to improve the security of the homeland until we see how that court action plays out. While some discuss, debate, and argue the name, title, or label that best describes the President's EO, professional men and women like me are actually in the business of implementing the President's intent to secure the nation, and we are doing that. We'll let the chattering class and self-appointed critics talk about the name. I just hope the Congress sees the wisdom in what the President is trying to do to protect America and its people, and that the Congress are willing to work with those of us in the business of securing the nation. And it's been my experience in less than 4 months on the job that the Congress is in fact committed to that. The court's injunction has prevented us from implementing a temporary ban on travel by aliens from 6 countries that are in states of civil war, are state sponsors of terrorism, and are basically failed states. They are the same countries identified by the Congress in previous administration in 2015 as nations of great concern. At the time, the expectation was that those in the business of securing the nation lawfully would focus additional attention on these nations and others in similar circumstances for supplementary and accurate vetting. It has nothing to do with religion or skin color or the way they live their lives, but all about security for the United States and nothing else. These are countries that are either unable or unwilling to help us validate the identities and backgrounds of persons within their borders. I can tell you right now, because of the injunctions, I am not fully confident that we're doing the best all that we can to weed out potential wrongdoers from these locations. The injunction also prevents me from actually looking into the information that we need from each country to conduct proper screening, not just from the 6 countries identified in the executive order, but from every country across the globe. It also prevents me from conducting a review under the executive order with the goal of improving the security of our refugee program. Bottom line, I've been enjoined from doing these things that I know would make America safe, and I anxiously await the court to complete its action one way or the other so I can get to work. The men and women of DHS will do everything we can and always, always, always within the law to keep the American people safe. But the delay has prevented us from doing that, what I and those most familiar with the reality of the threats we face believe we need to do to protect our homeland. Again, sir, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee today, and I thank you for your continued support and the committee's continued support for the great men and women of the department and the mission we take so seriously. I remain committed to working with Congress in protecting the American people. I have made changes within the organization since I've been the department head to do exactly that, to increase responsiveness, availability of witnesses, and we've done all of that in a big way. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Secretary Kelly. I really appreciate the attendance by my colleagues. I know everybody's got tight schedules, so I'm going to defer my questioning so people have their opportunities. I'll start out with Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the note you ended on, Secretary Kelly, and while I condemn the leak and the person who leaked it, we now have in the public domain verified information that the Russians made an aggressive attempt to access not only a vendor of voter software in this country, but also a number of states, the voter file databases in the month prior to our election. I mean, in any other circumstances, this would be an earthquake. But because of everything else that's going on, I don't think enough attention has been given to something that is your responsibility as the Secretary of Homeland Security, and that is critical infrastructure, including the election systems. I have asked for a number of pieces of information. This is one area where we have not gotten a response yet. I do appreciate that you all have not frozen us out. Many of my colleagues are being frozen out across the government. You have not frozen us out, and I'm deeply grateful for that. I am anxious to get more information about what we know about these attempts. Whether or not they accessed the tabulation, it's clear they were trying to get into voter files. And I don't think they were going there to try to just hang out. Imagine the disruption. We spent a lot of time in this country talking about voter ID. Imagine the disruption if thousands of people showed up to vote and their names were no longer on the voter files. What would we do? How would we address that in terms of fairness and open and free elections? So I guess my question to you is, are you deferring the investigation of this to the FBI? Or is the department actually actively engaged in investigating the penetration or the attempts to penetrate the voter files in this country immediately before the election by the Russian government?
Thanks, Senator. You know me, I'm not going to dodge any question relative to anything that anyone in the United States Congress asks. I would say, though, up front, I would not because of the allegations and the things that have been allegedly released are so highly classified, I wouldn't want to kind of confirm or deny anything in there. I think we just have to wait for the investigation. Happy to come over or send people over to talk to you to the level that they can about what actually took place. And I believe certainly members of Congress deserve that, given levels of classification. But I share your concern. I don't disagree with anything you said relative to the sanctity of our voting process. Clearly, it's should be an interagency investigation, and that is taking place. DHS will be part of that. As you know, just prior to his leaving, Jay Johnson went out and declared that the voting infrastructure was in fact critical infrastructure. I've had a large amount of pushback on that from the states, many members of Congress. It was done before I took over. We're looking at that, trying to help the states understand what that means, and it's voluntary entirely. We're here to help, so to speak. But I am meeting with the state Homeland Security professionals, I think, next week here in the city, and I'm going to put that question to them. Should we back off on that? I don't believe we should, but should we back off on that? Do you see us as partners and helpers in this to help, you know, down inside the states and help you make sure that your systems are protected? But there is nothing more fundamental to our democracy than voting.
Well, you know, in following up with that, I just hope that you convey, I mean, it would be one thing for the states to say, we don't want the federal government to be, I like that our elections are decentralized. Right. I don't think the federal government should be telling each state how to run their elections or what vendors to use. On the other hand, this was Russia.
Right.
I mean, this was Russia. This was not, you know, some hacker at a university trying to screw around with one individual state. This was an international attempt to impact the elections of the United States of America. So it really would be, I think, distressing if the United States would then pull back from the ability to help states protect these voter files. And you all are going to be in the best position to be able to do that. So is someone from the department working in the investigation
we are.
Over this intrusion into our data files,
yes,
our voter data files?
We are involved.
Okay. The other area I wanted to talk about and give you a chance to respond to the things I said in my opening statement about cutting funding for the VIPER program and for the law enforcement officer reimbursement program, at the urban area grants that are so important to large cities in this country in terms of protecting soft targets for terrorism. Could you address those cuts and if you would be okay with the fact that we would maybe want to restore those cuts?
I'd like to comment for sure. The first thing I would, and I kind of referenced it a little bit in my opening statement, we are, as a nation, in a different place entirely from a law enforcement and local protection point of view. We're in a different place today than we were 15 years ago when 9/11 first took place. I mean, whether it's New York City and the largest non-federal law enforcement organization in the country, the New York City Police Department, or small towns and counties with very few professionals. This kind of thinking, this anti-terrorism, counterterrorism is in the DNA. We have certainly and should have right after 9/11 for years afterwards, I think to the tune now of $45 billion in 15 years, helped states, whether it was acquire equipment, hire people. DOD has a program where they give excess equipment away. You know all of that. So we're in a different place today. New York City Police Department, I was just up there last week and sat with them for several hours getting their concept of how they protect the city from a terrorism point of view, and I don't think there's anyone better in the world. So in a perfect world, I'd love to fund everything, but in 15 years on, we are in a different place locally and federally in terms of protecting the homeland. Again, in a perfect world, I'd love to fund everything.
Okay, well, I understand the point you're making, although I will say that I don't think any of us would think that the threat of a terrorist attack is less today than it was 15 years ago. And I can speak for many of these communities that are struggling with enough officers now. St. Louis is a good example where we have a serious crime problem, and in order to have the resources they need to cover the airport, to do some of the things that this money allows them to do is really important. So I'm hoping that we can work together and figure that out.
Senator, if I could respond, I wouldn't disagree at all. And the threat since 9/11 is, I think, certain types of threats are much more than they were during 9/11, much more metastasized, some of it local, some of it potentially from outside the country. I'm with you 1,000%. But the one fundamental difference is we have different state, local, and federal focus on this in training and equipment.
We do.
So, yes, ma'am.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And once again, thank you for being here, Secretary Kelly. I think that you have bipartisan support on this committee because of your track record. And you were in front of the subcommittee on Homeland Security here a few weeks back, and I appreciate your testimony there. Since then, it was reported that the President's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, attempted to establish secret back-channel communications with the Kremlin through Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. You were asked about these back-channel communications with Russia on TV, and you supported Kushner setting up back-channel communications. The White House has been mum about these communications. I believe if these communications did occur, whether there was anything classified or not that went through, I think this is a big deal because we're talking about Russia. I looked up your age, and I thought we might be similar in age, and to your credit, you're a little bit older than me, but you look younger, okay, Mr. Secretary. But you remember Russia in the height of the Cold War. I don't trust them any more today than I did when I was a first grader in school. And to have somebody this close to the president setting up back channels before they were in office through a Russian embassy is very disturbing to me if in fact this happened. And so have you spoken to Mr. Kushner about this issue?
I have not.
Okay, so has anybody spoken to him about this issue in your department, or to find out if this happened and what kind of information was relayed? We just heard the ranking member talk about potential impacts on elections. We've talked about potential money flowing to the Trump business enterprise. There's all sorts of smoke here that we need to get to the bottom of, and so I'm curious about that.
I hope no one in my department spoken to him. That would be inappropriate. I'm the interaction with the White House as a general rule. He doesn't work, like many of the White House staff do not work directly. But if I could, sir, on the back channel. Back channel communications, I mean, I have back channel communications myself from through religious leaders in the United States to leaders in, say, Latin America. It's one thing if I call the president of a country and tell him, you know, have a conversation with him. It's different if it comes from another direction. It's just the reality of the way things work. I would just offer to you, sir, that we have to make the assumption, and I will, that Jared Kushner is a great American. He's a decent American. He has a security clearance at the highest level, as I understand it.
Didn't then, though, did he?
And if he was opening, I believe he should have had. Now, if he was trying to open back channel communications to pass information through that back channel to get to Putin or anyone else over there to say, hey, look, we're concerned about this, or this is what you might want to consider doing, because if it's official, then it's a whole different dynamic.
I got you. So there, but the question is there's no red flags that come up for you at all on this?
Not at the time. I didn't know about it. Since it's been reported, back channels are the normal, are in the course of normal interactions with other countries, very common.
Can you tell me if it's also normal to go to an embassy of a country that has been our foe since World War II and do this kind? Is that normal?
I don't know if that was the case, but if that is the case, I'm not so sure it's normal, but certainly it would be one way to communicate through the back channel.
So if I were to do that, you guys would think that's okay? If I've got a security clearance, if I were to walk over to an embassy and say, hey, look, I want to have a back channel communication, and by the way, even though it appears that nobody in the United States will know what I'm talking about, and this is why I did it, it's okay, because I'm not.
No, Senator, I mean, really? I think if you went over to, whether you met them here in the building, or you
went to the embassy,
or went to the embassy,
the Russian embassy.
Let me tell you something. As a senator from the great state of Montana and a member of these committees, this is BS what you're doing, and you better stop it, or whatever. Or they could be very. That's essentially a back channel communication.
Well, I would just say this. I appreciate your faith in the system. I'm going to tell you that whether classified information was delivered or not, I find this unacceptable. I just do. To have somebody who is a son-in-law to the president that goes in and sets up with Russia, the country that I was told to hide under the desk when the nuclear bombs came, what the hell good that would do, I don't know, when I was in first grade. I just think if we don't get to the bottom of what's going on and what's happening, we've talked about the Russians, we've talked about money, there's all sorts of stuff going on here. And as Claire, I mean, as the ranking member said, there's so much going on here that we don't know which direction to have the investigation happen. And if it needs to be you've got the credentials, by the way, and you've got the respect, I believe, on this committee and probably in Congress to really find out what the hell's going on, because it doesn't make me sleep better at night. I will just tell you, and if it doesn't make me sleep better at night, your probably eyes are wide open on this. Am I just?
No, Senator, I think we have to make the assumption that.
But don't you think we should ensure that assumption is correct?
Oh, sure, and I think there's.
But nobody's doing that.
I think there's numerous investigations that are looking into this. I mean, I think it's part of the Bob Mueller investigation. I think there's a number of congressional committees looking into it.
Okay. Another topic. I just want to echo what the ranking member said. There have been folks that have been frozen out by different agencies. I think that's inappropriate, whether you're on that committee or whether you're a member of Congress. Oversight is our big job. I appreciate you not doing that, and I hope that policy continues. I would assume that that's going to be the case, correct?
Yes, sir. And if I could comment,
yes.
As I was going through the process of confirmation, those senators that gave me and House members gave me the courtesy of an office call prior to the hearing, the one single thing I heard repeatedly was how non-responsive this department, my department, our department was prior to. Okay. I would tell you, since I've been running the show to the degree that I think I'm running it, we've got over 37 appearances in congressional hearings, 57 witnesses, 973 Hill engagements. That is prior to that, it was a tiny fraction. In fact, I was just talking to Senator Grassley, who was the biggest critic of my department relative to congressional engagement, and I was on an open phone with him and his staff and asked him how we were doing. He gave me nothing but high marks. We're going to make that better. Some of the things first of all, we're leaning forward. And whether it's, regardless of who the letter comes from, and it doesn't have to just come from a ranking member or chairman, we'll respond to any congressional inquiry. If we can't get to it right away, some of the letters, as you might imagine, are lengthy and need a great detail. Sometimes. My folks will call, if it falls into the category we can't get to it real quick and respond, we'll call the staff and say, hey, we got it, and we're on it, but it'll be some weeks or even perhaps months before we can get it to you. If need be, we'll send a letter, or I'll call the member and say, boy, this is a big one. I'm going to have to set some people to work on this. It'll be a while, but we're on it. And I think in every case thus far, certainly in the last 90 days, 60 days anyways, we're getting high marks. So I will not freeze you out, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I look forward to seeing you in Montana. Thank you, Mr.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Kelly, for being here today. And I'd like to once again thank you for your trip to Detroit. I think it was very, well received by the community, and I appreciate you taking the effort to come out to my state. Secretary Kelly, I'm particularly concerned about some of the proposed cuts to several FEMA preparedness grant programs that are in the President's budget. Our first responders in Michigan use the Urban Area Security Initiative and State Homeland Security program funding to support life-saving efforts, including bomb search and rescue equipment, simulation drills, maintenance of local early warning, and emergency response centers. The proposed 25% cost share matching requirement for local governments would prevent a number of these efforts because, quite frankly, many of these departments simply don't have the money available for that cost share. And I know you think it's important that there's skin in the game. You've used that term frequently, that our local communities have some cash as they are in these matching programs. But given the fact that we're facing lone wolf attacks and a lot of changes in how our domestic Homeland Security folks have to deal with situations, do you believe how are they able to make the appropriate investments to make sure that they're equipped for these types of attacks? Are there some other alternatives, or are there ways that we could perhaps adjust that figure in the budget?
Yes, Senator. Referencing a couple of my previous comments in this hearing as well as in the past, our local law enforcement, city, state, county, big city, small city, they're in a different place today than they were right after 9/11, and we all know that. They're just much better at what they do. Their head is in the game. They have skin in the game. The grants over the years have, to a degree, caused that to happen because we've given additional funding to the various municipalities to improve themselves. We're at the point now where much of that effort is already accomplished, and we're in the sustainment phase. That is to say, states and local governments now need to sustain what we've helped them, the points at which and the equipment and all that we've helped them get to. That combined with their unlimited resources. One of the things you mentioned, lone wolf attacks. A lone wolf, and you know this, sir, and I beg your forgiveness. Don't mean to lecture, not lecture, but to go too low in terms of my response. But the thing we're facing now with the lone wolf attacks is a different dynamic. It is absolutely, New York City is at risk, Detroit's at risk, yet some tiny little town in the middle of Arkansas is at risk. Every small town, big town is at risk from this lone wolf stuff. I don't know, as hard as I've thought about it, if there's a way to prevent it, predict it, get our arms around it, other than, local cops and sheriffs getting into people's business and legally, outreach and all of that kind of thing. But my point is, an unlimited amount of money parceled out to every big city, small municipality in America might prevent a lone wolf attack. I don't know if it will, but might. But of course, we don't have an unlimited amount of money. We make these decisions in many ways based on formulas that we receive from the Congress. We plug in numbers and try to somehow evaluate what might be a logical target. Not necessarily for the lone wolfers; they're everywhere, but a logical target or a target that might be at higher risk, say New York City, than another municipality, particularly from an external terrorist.
Well, I understand that, and I appreciate the fact that this is a big challenge, and we don't have unlimited amounts of money, but I want to just challenge a little bit of the assessment that the communities are adequately prepared for it. Certainly, we've come a long way, as you mentioned. We've come a long way and provided those resources, but I'm certainly hearing from my departments in Michigan there's still unmet needs that they think are pretty critical, and resources are tight for them as well. And we still have a ways to go. So hopefully we can revisit some of those matching programs to make sure that those communities that may be at the highest risk, but also have a fairly challenging budget situation in that community, that we're able to work something out. I'd appreciate having further discussion in that area. Also, Mr. Secretary, the first travel ban executive order required the Secretary of Homeland Security to submit a report in 30 days that provides a list of countries that do not provide adequate information for vetting within 30 days of the date of this order. And it's my understanding the District Court in Seattle did not stay that aspect of the order. The second executive order required the exact same report within 20 days of its effective date. And as you know, aside from sections 2 and 6, the remainder of the revised executive order is not affected by any subsequent injunctions. So that means as of today, May 6, 2017, the report required by the first executive order is overdue by over 60 days, more than twice as much time as required, and report required by the second executive order is overdue by about 30 days. Mr. Secretary, did you begin the report reviewing screening procedures that the initial executive order required?
Senator, we've been very, very, very cautious, extra cautious in getting anywhere near where the court might consider we're not following their instructions. I would have to get back to you on exactly where we are on the reports. One of the things that, regardless of whether the court has told us not to do, we've looked for things that we could do. As an example, thinking about other countries, but not studying it, and looking at vetting procedures, additional vetting, extreme vetting, but not studying it. Some of the procedures would be very obvious. Some of the countries very obvious. But if you don't mind, I'd like to get back to you on the question.
Well, I appreciate it, because it seems to me a court injunction is not going to limit you from doing your own internal reviews of policies and procedures. That goes
I actually
beyond.
have lawyers telling me, sir, that we are too close on some of these issues, not necessarily the ones you've addressed, but on some of these issues, and it's best just to show extra good faith and not getting too close to it.
Very good. Well, I'd appreciate further discussions on that as well.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, and good morning, Secretary Kelly, and thank you for being here. Like all of my colleagues, I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation with us. Last week, I visited our CBP base covering New Hampshire's northern border with Canada. The men and women at the station are working overtime and on a shoestring budget to secure our northern border, including intercepting human traffickers and preventing narcotic smuggling. I think they're doing an incredible job with truly limited resources, but they really need more support. And while CBP is getting a huge boost in their funding in this budget, we know that this funding isn't going to be used to shore up the northern border. And it isn't just CBP's northern border forces. They aren't the only ones getting shorted in this budget. As some of the other members here have indicated, TSA, in charge of protecting our aviation borders and stopping terrorists from taking down our aviation system, is facing a sizable cut to some of its key programs and renewed aviation threats. And the Coast Guard protects our nation's largest border, but despite its aging maritime assets, rundown, and frankly outdated facilities, the Coast Guard's also getting cut. So this budget tells me that your priority is to secure the southern border and that fighting off all other threats is secondary. I certainly support securing the southern border and reducing narcotics trafficking, but this budget presents really, I think, a false choice. We can and should secure the southern border and also secure our other land, sea, and air borders as well. So what is your plan for making sure that our northern border forces, TSA, and the Coast Guards get the funding increases they so desperately need?
Well, Senator, the good news is, from my perspective, and certainly what I've learned in the last going on 4 months, is we have two great partners in this effort to secure our borders, Canada to the north, obviously, and Mexico to the south. The bad news for Mexico in the southwest border is, largely because of our drug demand, an incredibly efficient network has developed that stretches, frankly, from around the world, goes through the Western Hemisphere, Caribbean, up the Central American Isthmus, Mexico, into the United States. So that's where the overwhelming amount of drugs, illegal aliens, special interest aliens come through, because of that network. Not because Mexico is not a partner, not because they're not great friends, but because of they're unfortunately astride a network or a landmass or a geographical feature that the drug traffickers has decided that that's how they're coming.
And Secretary Kelly, I'm well aware of that. I'm also well aware of how able, nimble, evolving, and creative these cartels and networks are. And so it just seems to me a totally false choice to leave a border inviting and open, relatively open. It may disrupt things on the southwest border for a time, but it doesn't do us any good if there are other ports of entry. And, you know, you talk to the Coast Guard right now, and they are not able to intervene in some of the narcotics traffic on our seas because they simply don't have the resources, even when they know that they're there. And that would be a very important aspect of our war on this drug epidemic we have.
Well, you're right on the northern border versus the southern border, but for right now, the southern border is the problem. If we were to seal the southern border, and I believe we can get, I know we will get control of our southern border. That doesn't mean seal it, but control it. Go from where we were several months ago to almost no control to some pretty good control. They will, given the drug demand in the United States, they will figure other ways to get through. We have to watch that and react to it.
And we also have to keep people in the northern part of our country safe. And so one of the things, you know, that's not a very reassuring answer to the people of New Hampshire or the other northern border states. I want to move on to another issue that we discussed the last time you were here. I asked you about an innovative way to protect DHS's systems from cyber attacks. and the possible application of the Pentagon's pilot program to use hackers to probe the Pentagon's networks for vulnerabilities. The pilot program was called Hack the Pentagon, and it was been very successful. In the few weeks that the program ran, the Pentagon collected 138 previously undiscovered vulnerabilities. Since then, the Pentagon has expanded the program, and GSA has announced an effort to launch a similar program. A little over a week ago, Senator Portman and I, along with others on this committee, introduced the Hack DHS Act. That bill would instruct DHS to hold a pilot program to allow hackers to probe DHS systems for vulnerabilities and report them to DHS. In return, DHS would pay the hackers a small sum of money for each vulnerability they discover and report. As my friend Senator Harris said, we will fight hackers with hackers. So as you can see, a lot has happened since you were last here. At the last hearing, you promised to look into whether the Pentagon's pilot program would be a fit for DHS. So I'm just asking you today that you take a hard look at this bill. There's also been a similar bill introduced today in the House by Representatives Liu and Taylor. And so would you just commit to taking a hard look at those bills and seeing what the department thinks of them?
Senator, absolutely will, and probably will not wait to see if this law passes.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, I don't want to reiterate, I guess I have two more points. I don't want to reiterate everything Senator Peters said, but I will just let you know, as a former governor who is in a state with lots of volunteer first responder forces, part-time police departments, and ongoing efforts to keep our state and do our part for our country's national security safe too. The elimination or severe cuts to critical state aid and grant programs for everything from airport security to other kinds of security efforts to fight homegrown terrorism, you have to train ongoing. You need ongoing resources. We have an enemy who's evolving. And the notion that just because we've made improvements since 9/11, we can absorb this kind of drastic cut, I think is just a really false notion. And I would tell you that having talked with my Homeland Security people in New Hampshire about the myriad of threats we're facing, the cuts here are really troubling. And lastly, if I may, Mr. Chair, I just would encourage, and maybe we can talk offline, about the President's Opioid Commission. I understand that the first interim report is due shortly. We just haven't heard anything about it. I know you're on the commission, and I'd love to talk later about that.
Well, and on that, if I could just have a minute, Mr. Chairman, to respond. Myself, Rex Tillerson, you may or may not have seen us with the Mexicans a couple of weeks ago. They're on board with our attempts to not only safeguard the southwest border, their northern border, but also get at the demand problem. I know Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Price, myself, and the head of ONDCP, who I've spoken to, and I like to think changed his attitude towards what his job is going forward. We'll get together and put some real energy behind the demand reduction to include, obviously, the opioids. But I think a big part of it, I think you will agree, I think we spoke about this, is this over-medicated society that we suffer from in the United States that just suggests to people all they got to do is put something up their nose, in their mouth, or in their arm to solve all their problems.
And one of the things that's going to be really important and really concerning, obviously, is the administration's support for eliminating things like Medicaid expansion and requirements that insurance companies treat addiction, which gets at the over-medication and the over-prescribing issue. So I look forward to talking with you more about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Hassan. I will again just point out, based on the baseline budget in 2004, those $36.5 million, had it grown by inflation, be about $48 billion. Instead, it's about $70. So $22 billion more growth in spending for this department because of those evolving threats. So I just want to point out what the reality is in terms of the increase in spending over the last, whatever that is, 13 years.
And if I may, and I appreciate that, Mr. Chair, my concern is that we are only as strong as our weakest link in this country.
We don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish, but we have dramatically increased the resources of this department. Senator Paul.
Secretary Kelly, thanks for your testimony. The last time you were here, we talked about U.S. citizens coming across the border and being threatened with non-entry or detention if they did not divulge the contents of their phone, all of the contents of their phone. And your response was, I just don't believe we're doing it. So we asked some questions in writing, and we're still waiting on the response. It's been about 6 weeks or so. But I thought I'd list for you a couple of the public episodes of this happening. This year, a NASA engineer and a U.S. citizen was pulled aside after coming back from Chile. They demanded the PIN for his phone, and they handed him a form that explained how CBP had the right to copy the contents of his phone, all the contents of his phone. He recalled that the form indicated that his participation in the search was mandatory, and it threatened detention and/or seizure if he did not comply. The phone, ironically, was already a government phone. It was a NASA phone that we were wanting to search. 2 citizens were stopped and returned from Canada. NBC did an investigation of 25 different cases of U.S. citizens being told to turn over their phones, unlock them, or provide passwords. A U.S. citizen was taken off of a flight in L.A., handcuffed and released after a Homeland Security agent looked through his phone for 15 minutes. A U.S. citizen journalist was also had their phone taken. So I guess my question is your answer still, I just don't believe we're doing it?
My answer is we don't do it routinely unless there's a reason why, so that's a change. We do it whether they're citizens or non-citizens coming in. I think it's, of the million or so people that come in the country, half of 1% is checked. Now, typically, the officer, and always according to the law. Now, typically, the officers who are engaged in the frontline defense at the ports of entry, in their questioning of individuals for whatever has tipped them off, will cause them to have certain conversations, go down certain avenues of not interrogation, but again, conversation in the event of some indicator that perhaps the individual is returning from, sex tourism or something like that. We do catch a fair number of people in that regard. But again, Senator, very seldom done and always for a reason and always within the law.
So the answer now is not, I just don't believe we're doing it. It's we are doing it, not that often.
Right.
The policy they're being threatened with, though, is detention. How long would they be detained if they don't give you the PIN to their phone?
Well, it's a relatively short period of time. That's generally called secondary, where they are there's follow-up questions and what. Once a decision might be made to put them into some legal justice system, then that's still no.
But to you, it's still you're just fine with a policy that arbitrarily takes someone's phone, says you can't come back into your own country?
Not arbitrarily. There's a reason why they do it, Senator.
Well, no. The thing is, it is arbitrary unless there are rules as to how you do it. What are the rules? In our country, if you want to look at my phone, you call a judge in my country. So this wouldn't necessarily be American jurisprudence if you're just saying, we might have some internal rules. Have you published what your rules are?
At the ports of entry, whether you're a citizen or a non-citizen, the officers have procedures to follow, but certainly rights to check baggage and, in this case, look into electronics. There are procedures. Whether they're published or not, are specific enough to publish, I don't know, but I can certainly get back to you.
We'd like to see that. We'd also like to see the form that threatens them with detention and or seizure if they don't comply.
Sure.
I can tell you I'm not happy with the policy, and I wish it were different. And we have actually introduced legislation to try to stop you from doing this and to make you go to a court the way we do in our country. Typically, we go to a court and you ask a judge, and you have to present evidence. You have to specify an individual, and you have to have a reason for doing it. Searching someone's phone is not the same as searching someone's luggage.
Would that law also prohibit us from looking in the, bags and things like that?
No, and I think there's a difference. And I think that that's the whole point here, is that looking at someone's luggage for an immediate threat to to the country, to the people, to the plane, et cetera, I think we've decided that that's within the scope of your jurisdiction. But looking at someone's phone is a much more personal, a much more extensive look into their life. And we just don't think you should be, it sort of horrifies us to think that you couldn't come back in your country. You know, people are now talking. There are whole people giving you advice to not take your phone abroad because when you come back home, your country won't let you come home unless you let them look at your entire life. That doesn't seem like a fair trade-off to be able to travel or for safety. And I think there is a point at which we give up so much of our liberty to travel that, you know, has it been worth it? You know, really. I mean, we can live in a secure state if we clamp down and we have no freedom to travel, you know, and we give up all of our privacy to travel. I just don't think that's necessary. And I think there can also be two different standards, frankly. I think there can be one standard for somebody who's coming for the first time from Afghanistan, who's got one name and no background. I'm with you, and we need to do more scrutiny on people coming to our country. But if an American citizen leaves and comes back, I think for goodness sakes, they ought to still be protected by the Bill of Rights when they come home.
Senator Hoeven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here and for your good and very important work. Where are we, or where are you, I guess, in terms of this extreme vetting process as far as having the procedures in place that you want, and particularly as regards the 6 countries included in the President's EO?
I'm sorry, sir.
Where are you in the process of establishing your extreme vetting procedures, the way you want to have them set up, and particularly as regards to the EO countries?
Because, again, of my not wanting to get crosswise with the courts in any law, we've been very reserved in that. I will tell you that, you know, there's 2 aspects of this. Some of it I control, some of it the State Department controls. The State Department has recently issued a number of additional questions, as an example, that their consular officers will ask those that want to visit the United States on visas. That's a little bit of an easier thing because typically those people are coming out of countries, well, they would present a passport as an example. And there's always been certain questions in place that they would ask. Now there'll be some additional questions about where they've lived, and you know, it could be access to their electronic devices, but that's outside the country. In the case of refugees, I think the senator knows that in many cases, the refugees that we deal with have no paperwork that we can rely on. They have no passports. We have to take their word for it. The UN, as hard as they try, and I think the last time I was here, one of the recent hearings talked about my interaction with the UN. They're in the same position we are, although they're not in the position of allowing people to come to a given country. They themselves, as they do their initial refugee screening, they don't do screening. They do refugee registration. What's your name? Where you're from? All of that taken on faith, good faith. And then it comes to us. In the past, we have, I think, exercised entirely too much good faith. And I think the things that we are looking at is, okay, if you don't have a passport, you have no proof of who you are, then we need to know some additional facts and figures about you. Well, how did you support yourself in a given country? Do you have any way to prove that you work for a living so that we can kind of prove who you are? What village are you at? Can you give us points of contact in a given country that we can call? That kind of thing. But in many cases, many of these refugees don't have any of that. So it'd be very hard for me in good faith to then move them into the United States to establish a home here. But we are, I believe what will give us an advantage is when we start to deal with them on their social media accounts, their telephone registrations, that kind of thing.
What about the visa waiver countries? You mentioned earlier that as we inflict defeat on ISIS in the Middle East, that there are individuals who've been in the Middle East and returning to other Western European and other countries with which we have visa waiver in place. What procedures, extra procedures, precautions are you taking to protect them from coming to the United States?
Well, as I think the Senator knows, there are 38 visa waiver countries. As you might imagine, I know you realize this, they're countries that have more or less what we have. They have a working relationship with the United States, to say the least. They have a U.S. embassy locally to handle our affairs and look out for us. They have kind of an FBI and in an intelligence community and all the rest of it, databases that allow us to tap into what they do. That's getting better, by the way, and I've got commitments from many countries around the world because of the laptop ban that we implemented in 10 airports about mid-March. But the point is, we're in pretty good shape in those. We're in very good shape in those countries. We have confidence in their systems and how they interact with our systems. Not every country, though, say in Europe, is a visa waiver country, because some of them have not got, even though they're Western countries, first world, they don't have what we think they need. So we set the bar very high, and they have, in most countries, certainly 38 have met that bar. But that said, again, the long pole in the tent is, as Jim Comey would say, if the database is only good if you're on it. And not to get into it, I don't want to be too open about this in an open hearing, but some of the more recent terrorists in England or UK may not have been on any of those lists, so that had they decided to come, you're exactly right, had they come to the United States, they would have certainly been able to buy a ticket and fly to the United States. Now, their baggage and everything would have been subject to the normal protocol. So my sense would be that, they wouldn't be getting on the airplane with a bomb or something like that. And if they got here, hopefully, and if they got here, and we're trying to do something about that, you know that. But if they got here, then it would possibly be problematic. But the point is, there's a certain point where I don't think we either have a visa waiver program or not. And I can tell you the 38 countries that are on it are committed to it. We're all committed to making it better. Right now, I'm comfortable with where we are on it.
But clearly, we have to react to events and take extra precautions, right?
We do.
In regard to Senator Hassan's comments regarding the northern border, one of the best tools you have, and you and I have talked about this both at Homeland Committee Appropriations as well as this committee, is the unmanned aerial systems, UAS. Kevin McAleenan, your acting CBP director, who, by the way, is absolutely fantastic, was out in Grand Forks. We have 900 miles of border responsibility, all different kind of terrain, all the way from Lake Superior, all the way throughout most of Montana. The UAS is a great tool. You're co-located in the Grand Forks Air Force Base. We're looking at new facilities. We're working with him. I would ask for your strong support for him in that effort. And also, with the technology park we have there at the Grand Forks Air Force Base, it is really a unique opportunity to develop that UAS tool, which helps you on the northern border and the southern border. So again, I want to commend him to you and ask for your support for his good efforts. That's a tool that can really address some of the concerns that she raised.
Senator, I agree with you. Thanks for the comments about Kevin. He is really a first-round draft choice.
He's an all-star.
I can't wait to get him confirmed, or
I agree.
Hopefully the Senate will confirm him.
Thank you for all you're doing.
Sure.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. Secretary Kelly, as a follow-up to Senator Tester's questions, you mentioned that you have, in your career, had back-channel conversations with foreign governments. Is that correct?
Had people I could rely on to pass information to foreign leaders.
And was that in your current capacity as a member of the President's Cabinet?
That was in my capacity when I was in uniform.
And did you ever initiate?
I wouldn't hesitate to do it now.
And did you initiate any of those conversations such that you initiated that they would take place inside the embassy of a foreign government?
I have gone to embassies, both in my current assignment as well as in past assignments, or met with members of the diplomatic corps from other countries.
Have you initiated back-channel conversations
to occur what I was saying?
Inside of those embassies as opposed to attending a cocktail party?
I've had conversations with members of foreign diplomats in various places and talked to them about my perception of what they could do better in response to things that the United States government would like to see them do.
Thank you. Secretary Kelly, included in the President's budget is a provision that says, quote, the Secretary of Homeland Security may condition a grant or cooperative agreement awarded by the Department of Homeland Security to a state or political subdivision of a state for a purpose related to immigration, national security, law enforcement, or preventing, preparing for, or protecting against, or responding to acts of terrorism. Specifically, the budget authorizes the Secretary to condition grants on compliance with any lawful request by DHS to detain an alien for a period not to exceed 48 hours. Are you familiar with that?
I'm fairly familiar with it, yes.
I'm sorry?
Fairly familiar with it, yes.
Grants that are subject to new conditions would include the Urban Area Security Initiative, a DHS grant that provided California last year with $124 million to help urban areas prevent, mitigate, and respond to acts of terrorism. This grant supports more than 100 incorporated jurisdictions in 12 counties in the Bay Area of California alone. It supports them to buy equipment, enhance systems, and conduct trainings so that localities can prevent, mitigate, and respond to acts of terrorism. Are you aware of that?
That's a good thing.
Another DHS grant is the State Homeland Security Grant Program that provided California $60.2 million last year to support state, local, and tribal efforts to prevent terrorism and to prepare the nation for threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk to security in the United States. Is that correct?
I wish I had the same document I could read from as you do.
Are you familiar with this grant program in your
I'm
department?
familiar with the grant program.
And are you aware that there are a number of federal courts that have imposed civil liability on local governments for complying with ICE detainer orders that were not supported by probable cause? Can you answer the question?
Am I aware of that?
Yes.
I am.
And in order then to comply with a 48-hour ICE detainer made with no probable cause, wouldn't that force the jurisdiction to choose whether to comply with a federal court ruling or forfeit vital public safety funds that are administered by your department?
I'm not a lawyer, but I think that federal law is federal law, is state law, and if you know, we have a different view of the impact of some of the state rulings, but I'm not.
Well, imagine, sir, if you will, that you were a local law enforcement leader presented with a choice of either complying with federal law that means that you may expose your department and your jurisdiction to civil liability, or forfeiting DHS funds that are designed and intended to help you fight terrorism at a local level. Wouldn't you agree that puts those law enforcement leaders in it's almost a Hobbesian choice?
Well, Senator,
how are they supposed to choose?
had you not cut me off, I would have said the same thing you just said. Probably not as eloquently, but I'd have said the same thing you said. I appreciate the fix they're in. I appreciate that they get their legal advice from the state and locals. And below the radar, we work with every police and sheriff department in this country to the degree that they can and are comfortable with.
Secretary Kelly, what do you mean below the radar? They have two choices, and they are accountable. Excuse me, sir. They are accountable to their jurisdiction, to the bodies that may have appointed or elected them. Right. And they have to make choices. What do you mean below the radar?
We talk to them on the telephone. And
what are you instructing them to do when presented with those two choices? And we
tell them to, whatever they can do within the law, the interpretation, we're willing to work with them.
So are you aware that there are local law enforcement?
At least finish once before you interrupt me?
Sir, with all due respect.
With all due respect, Senator.
Are you instructing local law enforcement leaders that they can overlook a DHS detainer request so they're not exposed to criminal liability?
We talk to them about whatever they're comfortable with, whatever they think they can do within the interpretation of their local attorneys general, as an example, or local lawyers.
So when they're instructed,
once,
excuse
Senator,
me, I'm asking the questions.
But I'm trying to answer the question.
When they tell you, as I know local police chiefs are being told, that it would expose their municipality to civil liability if they comply with the detainer request, are you telling them that you will not withhold the DHS federal funding that they rely on?
Okay, before I start to answer, will you let me finish?
If it's responsive to the question, of course.
We talk to them on the phone and tell them whatever they're comfortable with, whatever they can do within the interpretation of their local lawyers or legal advisors, we'll work with them.
So are you willing to then not withhold federal funding when police chiefs tell you that they cannot comply with the detainer request because they've been told by their lawyer that they will expose their jurisdiction or their department to civil liability?
I'm willing to work with them in any way I can within the law, federal and local law, whatever they're comfortable with. I don't make threats to people, Senator.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Harris. By the way, there's actually a very simple fix for this predicament, and it's a huge predicament. Let's pass a law to give those local law enforcement officials liability protection against those civil suits. It was part of Pat Toomey's sanctuary city law that could clear up this whole difference. So there's actually a pretty simple fix here, which I would certainly support.
Well, and I would support any fix that would not withhold funding for local law enforcement to meet the demands that they face around combating terrorism in their local jurisdiction.
So this could be a bipartisan solution here. Let's provide that civil liability protection against those civil suits so local law enforcement aren't caught between a rock and a hard place in a very difficult situation. So let's work on that together. I'd appreciate that. I'm sure Secretary Kelly would enjoy working with us on that as well. Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for joining us today. It's good to see you. When I first heard the words St. Elizabeth's, I thought, why would we spend that much money on creating a campus, if you will, a home, a consolidated home for the Department of Homeland Security? And over time, I became convinced that one of the ways to actually enable the leadership of this department to manage their department and to improve their performance and, frankly, improve the morale of the employees is to actually pursue and implement the plan to create this campus. When Jay Johnson became the secretary, he had the same kind of misgivings that I originally had about the proposal. Would you just take a moment and tell us where you've had a chance to get a feel for this and how your department's just so far flung, right. And what do you think we ought to do, and how does the administration's budget actually take us in that direction, or not?
Well, Senator, Senator, we are in. I can't count the number of locations around the city, various parts. Every part of Homeland Security is just spread out over all of Hell's Half Acre here. To bring all or most of it or some of it together over at St. Elizabeth's makes a lot of sense, just from the point of view of time management. I mean, first, in money. We spend a huge amount of money renting, choice downtown real estate here in the city. We could avoid much of that. I think we would realize if and when St. Elizabeth's open, billions of dollars in savings over 5 and 10 years. But the other issue is time management. I mean, it takes me a half an hour to get from where I sit most of the time to meet with CVP or Rice or whatever, and then obviously, half an hour to get back. Sometimes I do that 2-3 times a day. It kills either my time management or their time management. I do the best I can not to inconvenience the people that work for me. But it would be an advantage to be more or less in one place. St. Elizabeth seems to be the locale. But frankly, as I've gotten smart on that particular location, there are some worker issues that we need to sort out, and we can do that in terms of transportation, access to metro, that kind of thing. But overall, it would be a cost savings as well as a time savings if we were to consolidate much of the headquarters effort in one location, St. Elizabeth's.
There are two pieces of the funding. One is for GSA, and the other is for the Department of Homeland Security. I think one is for infrastructure, and one is for, if you will, for fit out. And one of them is, I think the GSA piece is funded in the 18 budget. The DHS funding is not there. So we'd like to follow up with you on that and certainly talk with our appropriators, some of whom are on this committee, I believe.
Sir.
I want to go back down to the southern border. We see some substantial increases in funding for CBP, for ICE, money for detention centers, money for a wall. There's also money for what I call force multipliers, and I'm a big believer in force multipliers. I'm not a big believer that we need a 2,000-mile wall. There's some places where a wall makes sense, but the idea of investing in these force multipliers that have been demonstrated to be effective is good. You and I have talked often about root causes, and the root causes of why the people continue to come from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador has a lot to do with our insatiable demand for drugs. The drugs are trafficked through those countries. They come to us. We send them money and guns. And we set up something called the Alliance for Prosperity a couple of years ago. Actually, those three countries set it up, and we came in, and as you know well, you were there at the creation, to try to emulate what was accomplished, what's been accomplished in Colombia. And do you have a sense for how things are going in those three countries with respect to the goals that they set themselves under the Alliance for Prosperity?
A great question, and really a great story. Not perfect, but a great story. Based on the confidence that the Congress and the previous administration put into the three northern tier countries in helping them out, recognizing that, first and foremost, they have a problem. Much of it is generated by our drug, insatiable appetite for drugs, that those countries are nearly failed states, much as Colombia was 20 years ago and isn't today. So the miracle can happen. I mean, Colombia did it. And frankly, at the time, Plan Colombia was put together by the United States Congress with a lot of resistance in other places. And as you know, I think, Senator, put some American money, I think 4 cents on the dollar, but ultimately there's a miracle that's happened in Colombia. So when people tell me it can't happen in Central America, I tell them to look at Colombia. So that said, the Alliance for Prosperity, the three countries putting their own money into it, and then through the Congress, the Obama administration, Vice President Biden was huge help in this, as you know. Got some additional U.S. funding put against it, controlled in the right way. So what's happened in Central America since we worked on Alliance for Prosperity? Violence is down. Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala used to be the three most dangerous countries on the planet, more dangerous, frankly, than Afghanistan and Iraq was at the time. They've cut their murder rates by either a third or more. Still horrific, but cut it a third or more, all with human rights in mind, all with the rule of law in mind. They have a long way to go, but their economies are starting to grow. They've gotten their arms around the corruption. 4 or 5 years ago when I took Southcom, everything was going in the wrong direction on Colombia or in Central America. I just read a report this morning where they've either stabilized, not getting worse, or getting better. That's huge. I think in addition to my outreach, back-channel communications in some respects to the leadership down there through religious organizations and NGOs so that I don't make it official, but they know where I am and where I'm going on these issues. We have also asked them to ask their citizens to not waste the money and head north, to not get on that terribly dangerous network that I've described before. Stay where they are, because if they come here, this is no longer an illegal, alien-friendly environment. It is a very legal alien, and as the Senator knows, 1.1 million people a year, but it is no longer a friendly environment for illegal aliens. Don't waste your money. Don't go on the dangerous network. What we're doing, we've put together, frankly, the DHS has been the energy behind it, although it's not my job, and we've passed it off to the State Department. So next week in Miami, we're bringing together as co-sponsors of a conference on the northern tier countries, Mexico, great country, great partner, and the United States co-sponsoring. We've got observers coming in, Canada, I think Spain, certainly Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, maybe Peru, for Due Day conference. That conference will be led by the Vice President. I'll be there, Secretaries Tillerson, as well as Commerce and Treasury will be there. The point is, the first day, we'll bring together investors to do the best we can to stimulate what's going on in those three countries economically. And then the next day will be security issues, trying to get at the human trafficking and the drug trafficking. And just last week, I was down in Haiti meeting with the new leadership there on another issue, suggested that maybe the Haitian president come on board for one of those days, or at least do a cameo type appearance. So what we're trying to do is help them solve their problems at home economically. We've already helped them solve the security problem, not solved, helped them go in the right direction on security. And with a little luck, with a little luck, we might actually be able to help them. But if we don't reduce the drug demand in the United States for heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine, this is all a complete waste of time.
Yeah. I did say to my colleagues, the Secretary said I asked a great question. I thought he gave a great answer. And I think you've made the case for continued support for the Alliance for Prosperity. Well, just like in Colombia, the lion's share of the responsibility rests on these three countries. We didn't just say to Colombia, we're going to come in and solve your problems. We said, you solve them, you can do it, and we can help. And we said the same thing with these three countries, and you made the case very well. I'm delighted to hear about the summit. I don't believe our schedules allow us to go and participate, unfortunately, but my thoughts and prayers will be with you and on your efforts in this regard. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator Carver. Just a moment of clarification. You mentioned 2,000 miles. So there's no confusion. This budget is literally requesting 74 miles of fencing. 60 new miles of fencing, 14 replacement in the San Diego sector. I was just down there. It's amazing how many holes have been cut into that San Diego wall and been repaired. And the 60 new miles, 32 miles of that is in Rio Grande sector, new fence, new wall, and 28 is part of a levee system. So again, we're talking about 74 miles over 1,700 to 2,000 mile. I think that's a pretty reasonable request. Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, welcome, Mr. Secretary. Of course, you know what my question is going to be. How soon are we going to see the Northern Border Report as mandated by federal law?
I'll get back to you today. I don't know, but let me take it. All seriousness, let me take it for the record. I'm sorry.
Okay. It's obviously we had hoped we would see it in June. I think we have some reason to believe it's going to be delayed. But it makes my broader point, which is, we need a strategic plan in terms of border security. And one thing that we hear about is fencing, and I've spent a lot of time on the southern border. I believe that barriers can be enormously effective as they have been in the San Diego area. But again, we know that most drugs, at least the previous administration would tell us that most of the drugs that we're talking about are coming through the points of entry and not walking across the border in remote locations. What additional strategies do you have to do additional screenings? Where's the investment in more personnel, more screenings, more technology at the points of entry?
In a sense, that's part of the border. I'm sorry. In a sense, that's part of the border strategy. There's no doubt, and I know a lot about this from my last job in particular, but there's no doubt that heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine primarily come through the border in vehicles, primarily. Marijuana is, in some cases, humped around, through the desert. But for the most part, the three big killers in the United States come in. And what if Kevin McAleenan and just a tremendous professional and dedicated, my hopes is that the Senate confirms him. But he's already in a role that makes him very, very valuable. I've asked him to look at the technology after next, in terms of looking into vehicles, tractor trailers, things like that. To look at the voids, as they're called, so we can decide which vehicles get searched, broken down, and to increase the number of vehicles. The other way to do that, we already do it in Canada, we're doing it in Mexico, and that is to work across the border where with the Mexicans or the Canadians in terms of facilitating movement of transportation, looking at vehicles before they're locked and sealed on the way north. So it's a multifaceted approach, but if I could, and I'll just end with, but if we're trying to do this on our border, we've kind of already lost. The place to take the tonnages out are working with the Mexicans, which we are, to help them locate the heroin, the poppy fields, which they can destroy, working with the Mexicans to identify, and we are, and they are destroying the methamphetamine labs.
And just to raise a concern there, we obviously have in the past had pretty good relationships with the country of Mexico. We saw in a regional election the ruling party coming very close, in fact, not getting a majority. The last thing we need is to not have strong and great relations with the country of Mexico. And so I just ask you and urge you, given your experience in the region, to encourage this administration to look at the entire relationship, whether it's a trade relationship, whether it's a border security relationship, or whether it's just respectful talk. that does us no good. I want to just
Work
cover
it every day.
I want to cover a couple quick points. I have beekeepers who can't get, I don't know what happened there. I didn't do it, though,
No, you didn't.
Secretary. I didn't hurt your shoulder. I have beekeepers who can't get seasonal workers in, and it just seems like the delays are getting longer and longer for the H-2B visas and the H-2A visas, and seasonal workers can't wait. How long do you think is a proper time frame to get an answer on whether we can get workers in the country? And what are you doing to meet the requirements of the law, but to expedite, especially for seasonal ag workers?
The A workers, I know we already have large numbers that come in and have been coming in over the years, but looking at on the B side, H-2B, working with labor, this is all about, in the current administration, this is all about American jobs versus people that come in and do the work.
Except I have doctors who can't get in. I mean, if the administration wants to send me beekeepers and doctors and a whole list of Americans who want those jobs, we'll be glad to do that in my state. But we've got to recognize that in the meantime, especially as it relates to physicians, it's extraordinarily difficult to recruit physicians to my state. And we have seasonal workers who we can't, obviously would love to hire locally, but that is becoming increasingly impossible. And so I'll probably submit a question for the record. Finally, because I'm running out of time and I want to get enough of this in, if you look at local border enforcement, the critical component in states like ours is not just technology, as Senator Hoeven talked about, but it's having a strategy and a plan. And that strategy and plan has to involve local law enforcement. You have Border Patrol in North Dakota that when they are patrolling the border, they aren't in radio contact with your people back in your points of entry, back where Border Patrol would muster and deploy. So we know that we have to have that backup. One thing that concerns me, and it goes to the FEMA grants, it goes to this idea that we can cut grant programs and still provide those services. Stone Garden's been an enormously successful program, really concerned about reductions in the commitments to local law enforcement, not just for border security, but for safety of the personnel who are on the border. So I would ask you to please pay close attention to this budget as it relates to working with local law enforcement, local first responders. They are force multipliers, and without those resources, they're going to have to cut back on resources, and that reduces our readiness. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Okay?
I will.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Heidkamp, I would ask you to take a look at my state-based temporary visa program. I think would solve an awful lot of that problem right there. And then just kind of a comment to majority staff, minority staff, as well as the Secretary. We should really have an alert for witnesses to be prepared to answer questions on the northern border. I think
way too much northern border on this.
There's not much of the northern border that isn't represented on this committee, so that's always an issue.
That's why I love appearing before this committee.
Senator Langford.
So my northern border is Kansas, and we've had our moments, but we're getting along just fine. So let me talk about a couple of other things as well. One is you and I have spoken even in the past 2 weeks about Real ID and some of the extensions and the process and the decision making on that. At the time we talked before, I said, hey, the deadline's coming up June the 6th. For that, we were going to try to get back to it quickly. There's been a delay on this. So there are several issues that are pending out there for states like mine and others that are working through the Real ID process. For those, our legislature's past issues with Real ID, working through implementation and such, that's been fairly automatic that if you're making progress and you're working through implementation, then those extensions are coming. It seems to have delayed this time to literally the very last second, and then we're still waiting to be able to determine what's the decision-making factor on that. So help me understand a little bit better so we can take that back.
That's all right. First thing I'd say, I had a lengthy meeting earlier this week, yesterday, on this, because actually today was the day that normally I would have made the decision to extend or not. Now, I think the Senator knows I think it's the 22nd of July before anything would stop.
Right.
So I have a little bit of time, and I've sent my staff back to kind of take a harder look at where, as you know, that most states are either compliant or getting towards compliant. In fact, there's really only one state that is kind of not going to, I believe, if all the promises are met, will not make it. But have asked my folks to go back and start looking at some of the states that have not been as active as they maybe should have been over the last 12 years to implement. They've been in contact with these states, the governors, the attorneys general, whoever's in charge of this kind of thing. We have, for the most part, commitments from the states to really get at this issue. But I've asked them to just go back one more time, if need be, talk to the states about the extension of what it means. Bottom line, in that meeting, they told me, the Secretary, three months ago, we had states that weren't even paying attention to this, that were getting dangerously close to not being able to implement before the deadline. They've all got the message, they said, Mr. Secretary, and with the exception of one state, they are all in there doing the right thing, getting close to it. So my sense is, I know I will make a decision next week. Likely will extend for 6 months till October, and then we'll take a hard look then. But the good news is, with a lot of pushing and shoving and mashing of teeth over the last 10 years or so, most states are on board, and I believe all but one will be compliant.
So let me give you a couple just inside pieces on this. When you talk about we've got a little bit of time until basically late July, let's say that at some point DHS comes out and says, nope, that driver's license is not going to be extended. Then that means everyone has to get to a passport, which in the summertime takes 6 weeks minimum to be able to do. Plus, you've got to contact people, and let's just start with a military base or a federal courthouse. And to be able to tell everyone coming to a federal courthouse, you're going to have something different. You're going to have to get a passport. Well, first you've got to identify who's coming to the federal courthouse and be able to contact those folks and give them 6 weeks of lead time to get their paperwork together to be able to do it. We're out of time. Once you get to a June the 6th time period, to know that deadline's really coming up. If drivers that are doing deliveries, if people that are refreshing the convenience store in a federal building, if people that are bringing groceries into the facility onto a military base, if they've got to all have some sort of other passport or something, that's going to take a long time to be able to get geared up. So the earlier those waivers can be released, the less anxiety it is in all of those locations, because all of them are currently spinning up in each of those states to try to figure out how we're going to accommodate around this, just to be able to get supplies and equipment brought in, or people coming in to apply for a job onto a military base as a civilian can't even come and do that without an escort to be able to do it. So that'll be a big issue. The hiring process we've talked about before for CBB, any progress on that of late? Because we're still talking 460 days for hiring, and then the polygraph issues. Have there been any changes since you and I have spoken last?
Yes, Senator, a couple of things. One, on the polygraph issue, we'll continue to polygraph, but there are other ways to polygraph. I didn't realize this, but Kevin McAleenan, who's the designate and hopefully will one day be confirmed for the directorship of CBP, has told me that there are other techniques, other questions, things like that still maintain the vetting process, but are faster. There are other parts of the federal government, not to mention the state and local, that have polygraph that are a lot less.
Right. So they've got a fail rate in the 30s. Right. CBP has it in the high 60s.
Yeah, my daughter works for the FBI. She said her polygraph was a fairly pleasant experience. Took an hour and 10 minutes. They asked all the right questions, and she was out of there. By contrast, 6-7 hours. So when I came in, said, let's take a look at
that. Could be the first time I've ever heard anyone say that polygraph was a fairly pleasant experience.
Right. Yeah.
So
I love it.
Yeah. So let me ask about the entry-exit program. Is everything still on schedule for that? We've spoken about that before.
Well, it's like anything. The entry at the airports, we're doing well.
It's the exit.
Working hard and entry at the ports of entry, but the exit is it's not a bridge too far, but it'll take some time, effort. But we're working towards it.
So the pilot is on track. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is by the end of next year, we're trying to implement that as a nationwide. Are we on track at this point to be able to implement that at airports nationwide? We still have a long way to go on vehicles and other entry-exit points. But
airports, I think I'm comfortable with saying yes.
Okay, so there was an announcement made by DHS on temporary protected status for Haitians to extend it for 6 months, but it basically raised the red flag for them and said, hey, this is it. The situation has changed in Haiti that demanded the temporary protected status years ago. It may or may not be there. What I want to ask is this an alert for Hondurans, for Salvadorans, for everybody on temporary protected status, that DHS is going to look at the situation that started temporary protected status and ask if that situation has changed?
Senator, it's an alert, but that said, for whatever reason, once someone goes on this status, traditionally or historically, they just automatically renew it.
Right.
The Central Americans have been on status. Some of the Central Americans have been on status over 20 years.
Right.
And they were put on status because of a hurricane that happened over 20 years ago. I can tell you that things are going better in Central America, much, much better over the last 20 years, in many ways better. But no one's ever looked at it. And I think that's something, we have to do that. It's a law. In Honduras, not Honduras, Haiti, 7 years ago. And the program is for a specific event. In Haiti, it was the earthquake. Yes, Haiti had horrible conditions before the earthquake, and those conditions aren't much better after the earthquake. But the earthquake was why TPS was granted, and that's how I have to look at it. Now, that said, and I don't want to get out too far out in front here, and I certainly wouldn't suggest anything hard to the Congress, but there's about, we don't know, 200,000 to 400,000 people in the United States on TPS. Vast majority of them behaving themselves. Vast majority of them have clearly got jobs and all the rest of it. They are here more or less legally. A lot of them weren't, but they were given TPS, so I'd make the assumption they're here legally. That may be, we may think, you may think, that a solution to this would be to look at them and say, okay, how many of them do we know are here, and use that against the 1.1 million legal migrants with a way towards citizenship. That may be a way to solve it. I can look at the Haitian situation, say 7 years, it's a long time, but it's not so long that some of them, all of them might be able to go back. 20 years, it's kind of hard, but I'd like to see this solved in another way, but according to the law, I don't have the ability to solve it. But the word is temporary, and I think those that have been in my position over the years have simply automatically extended it. So the 6 months, and I was down in Haiti last week, spoke with the leadership. I said, during the 6 months, you, Haiti, need to start thinking about travel documents and how you're going to bring these people, who, by the way, are generally better educated, entrepreneurial, would be, I think, a boost to the Haitian economy and social function. And by the same token, those that have been allowed to the United States to remain in the United States under TPS should start thinking about going back to their homeland, unless and if they feel as though, and I said this in Miami right after the Haitian trip, many of them at this point probably have different immigration status anyways, in the sense that they've married local men and women or whatever. So they need to go down and get consult with an immigration expert to find out if they have status. But at the end of it, the word is temporary unless we change that, unless you change that to permanent somehow.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kelly, it's good to see you again. Montana recently passed a law, and it's been signed by our governor, for real ID that I think is going to bring us a solution to the dilemma we faced, by the way. We still need an extension to get it put in place, but we will offer Montanans 2 IDs. You can get a real ID compliant driver's license or one that's not, and pay a premium for the real ID compliant, but I think we have a path going forward. We'll need an extension just as we get the system implemented, but the governor has signed the bill. I think we finally have a path forward with the impasse we've had here for certainly quite some time. I got to say something here, Secretary Kelly. This chart you shared showing the reduction in apprehensions across the southwest border, I think is one of the most undertold stories in the country at the moment. To think that we have seen a nearly 70% drop in illegal southern border crossings under your first few months of leadership, and it was accomplished by sending a message to the world, and particularly down south, that the United States would enforce its laws. thank you, as we are a nation of law and not a nation of men, that you have led with President Trump. And I think we need to get this message out more. I've spoken to a lot of my friends and constituents back in Montana, and that message needs to get out. So congratulations. And as we've seen these horrific attacks in London, there's breaking news now of a crazed man in Notre Dame Cathedral here in the last few hours. Who knows if it's a terrorist attack or not, but the point is it seems like we're 24/7 breaking news with these horrific attacks around the world we've seen in London. Our Homeland Security will remain our top priority and challenge, and I look forward to continue to work with you to ensure you have the resources to keep our nation safe. Secretary Kelly, we've discussed the impact of methamphetamines coming from the south of the border on Montana's families. In fact, about 1/3 of the children in the Montana foster care system are there because of parental meth use. And most of that meth, we believe, is coming from Mexico. Recently, Senator Peters joined me in introducing the Child Protection and Family Support Act. It's going to help these children, but we also need to continue to fight against the flow of drugs. I know CBP is requesting an additional $2.9 billion. What will this mean for the interdiction of meth at the border?
I hate to say this, probably a drop in the bucket. Necessary. And you and I have talked about this, Senator, and made a few comments since this hearing. It's really, we've got to take a much more holistic approach to this. Demand reduction, rehabilitation. Certainly law enforcement plays a role in the homeland. The southwest border plays a role. Our partnership with Mexico, and here I think it gets more and more important, our partnership with Mexico, to use the example of heroin and meth, as you say, they're cooperative with us. Just recently, within the last 60 days, they destroyed 2 massive methamphetamine labs. And by the way, the reason the production of meth has migrated so heavily towards Mexico, and this is the balloon effect we talk about. When we do something that's effective, the cartels figure out a way to get around it, and it's a cat and mouse game. It never ends. Right now it's the southern border, as I mentioned earlier. Tomorrow could be the southern border or containers, depending on how effective we are. So the United States Congress passed legislation, I don't know, 10 years ago, something like that, and restricted the precursor chemicals, the availability of the precursor chemicals to make meth. Up until that point, meth was made in a million little, places in the United States and tiny little laboratories, and I use the term loosely there. Two things. We reduced, the Congress reduced the availability of the precursors, and the cartels, as they have become more and more successful and sophisticated, said, okay, well, if they're responding to a market. The United States wants to try to kill themselves on methamphetamine. Heck, we can do it for them. And so that's why it's migrated. Again, congressional action in terms of restricting the precursors, and then simply the cartels taking it up and marketing it. So that's primarily, in my view, the solution to the problem. Working with Mexico, yes, the southwest border for sure, and increasing the amount of we take there, yes. Internal U.S. law enforcement. But sir, Senator, it really is all about demand reduction. That we will always have addicts. Studies tell you that there's any population, ours included, there's certain people predisposed to being addicted to something. But an awful lot of these people, my personal experience as a kid, an awful lot of people start doing drugs because it's cool. There's no argument against it. And suddenly they're hooked on something, fill in the blanks, and they can't get away from it. We have not solved, I have appeared in this hearing a year ago, April, and talked about this issue of how we have managed to convince people over the years, seatbelts, smoking, a lot of different things. You never get to zero, but we could do a lot better. The President has got DHS, state, HHS in the lead, ONDCP. So if we could get a comprehensive drug demand strategy put together that just, it's not law enforcement, it's Hollywood, it's professional sports, college sports, the President of the United States, the Senate, everyone out there, the influencers, we can solve this problem or reduce this problem significantly. But back to your original question, we need the money. but it's a holistic thing, and it's not just a CVP guy on the border.
You know, Senator Portman and I and a couple others were over in Beijing just a couple months ago working on getting U.S. beef into China. It was one of our missions. We were talking North Korea as well, but Senator Portman brought up the issue with the Chinese government to stop the flow of fentanyl and carfentanil, which you can buy in the dark web. Oftentimes it comes out of China. So this holistic approach is certainly the right approach, and we'll continue to work with you on that. I want to shift gears before I run out of time and talk cyber. As the budget request reflects, cyber is a national priority. The requested increase from the National Protection and Programs Directorate would help meet the current cyber threats, but we need to also stay ahead of these emerging threats that we see everywhere. Back in February, in fact, I introduced a bill, the Support for Rapid Innovation Act, which provided the Science and Technology Directorate direction and authority to leverage limited resources with the private sector and academia to research and develop the next generation of cyber protection capabilities. Despite the proposed cuts, Secretary Kelly, how will the S&T continue to support cyber R&D in fiscal 18?
Sir, first of all, I'd like to just say a couple of words about the effort right now. On the morning that the malware was unleashed on Europe, I went to the White House Situation Room, and as we watched that worm its way around the world, infecting hundreds of thousands of systems, and we had FBI, DHS, and everybody. We had already when it first started, DHS had made notification to those private and public entities that we deal with constantly and said, something's up, put the word out, put the alert out. Other parts of, including DHS, started to do the forensics on the thing. What is it? What's it doing? What's it made up of? Where did it come from? And I'm very proud to say that everyone in the room was constantly deferring to what's next. What do we do next? This includes NSA with DHS. Not the DHS professionals did it all, but we were the central focus of it. And I am very proud to say that through the efforts of my predecessors in the United States Congress and others, that malware came to the United States, but was contained to a handful of systems and contained within those systems. It's as if it never came across the ocean, so to speak, and we helped nations overseas contain it. That said, we need to get better because the threat is changing, morphing, and this administration, to pat it on the back, and certainly my Department of Homeland Security are focused on increasing the protections better than they are now, particularly as we interact, and we do heavily interact with private entities, Microsoft, people like that. It is one team, one fight, and can only get better.
Thank you, Secretary Kelly. And I just want to thank you again for when the President asked you to serve in this capacity, that you said yes. I'm just grateful for your leadership and the early results you're already seeing because of your leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Hey, Senator Daines, I've just got a couple of closing questions, Secretary Kelly. First of all, I am concerned about funding for the Coast Guard. When I'm going through this, I've asked staff to, how much. I was hoping Department of Defense made up a fair amount of funding too, but they really contribute only about $500 million per year. So you take a look, since 2009, the funding for the Coast, or the budget was about $9.6 billion. Now it's about $10.6 billion. Okay, 10% increase, but with the kind of threats we're facing, can you give me any kind of comfort that that's adequate?
I can't. I think the Coast Guard, first of all, is just an amazing organization. I really came into my view when I was in Southern Command. I mean, I'd seen them sprinkled around the world in the Persian Gulf, places like that, but it really came into my view in Southern Command about how good they are. Obviously they're one of the 5 military services, small, and in my opinion, in exactly the right place, DHS. But the myriad of missions that they execute and the authorities they have are just make them value added, to say the least. But it's not big enough. I mean, they're the biggest problem with the Coast Guard. I think if the Commandant was sitting right here, he'd pat me on the back to say, we need to recapitalize. They have, they have some brand new cutters coming on, national security cutters, valuable, essential, but so much of the Coast Guard is so old that it just limps along. And I think we have a plan. I'd love to add to that plan, but I think we have a plan. And all of this is not to mention We've got to get involved in the Arctic more than we are. We have some couple of broken down old icebreakers that we're looking to buy 6, 3 heavy, 3 medium, to work up there in the northern reaches. We've got to be up there, not to contest anyone's claims, but to simply work up there, particularly as importantly, work in terms of the environmental protection of that precious, international asset. So, but it's not big enough. But it's
let's work together with Senator Bozeman and his subcommittee. Let's see what we can do on that, because I share your concern. I was just in Bratislava, and your predecessor, Secretary Chertoff, was there, gave a speech, and he talked about the impact that the visa waiver program had when they were able to expand it to some of these nations. I'm highly concerned. I'm also chairman of the European Subcommittee on Foreign Relations, and I'm concerned about the destabilizing nature of Russia, their pervasive disinformation propaganda campaign. And if we ignore Central and Southeastern Europe, we have, there's a real concern that those nations don't join the West. And Secretary Chertoff made a very powerful comment about how that visa waiver program was sort of the stamp that really did solidify the fact that these nations that were granted the visa waiver were going to remain in the West and stay Western facing. I personally think the visa waiver program enhanced our security. It's not, there are risks associated with it, but the safeguards put in place to qualify. It just seems like such a political heavy lift right now. Secretary Chertoff certainly offered every ounce of help he could have. Can you just kind of comment on your viewpoint of the visa waiver program and expansion? Because let's face it, every one of those nations wants it.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Senator, I'd love to expand it to everybody. We've set the bar very, very high. In countries that meet that standard, welcome aboard. There are, and I share your concern with the Eastern European countries. As a kind of a sidebar comment, when I was working in Mons, Belgium, years ago as a colonel, the enthusiasm after the wall fell, the enthusiasm of all of those countries, they've fallen all over themselves. How do we get into NATO? How do we become observers? How do we? That's been cooled a little bit for whatever reason. Well, you and I both know the reason. So I think anything we can do to expand it. The good news is there's a lot of countries out there that are trying to get up to our level of security and satisfy us. And there are some countries that are close, some countries that are not so
we should kind of review some of those metrics. Are they realistic? Can we look at those and still maintain the kind of security we're looking for? So I'd like to work with you. I mean, that's kind of a long-term project. Then just finally, because I think some people may view this with skepticism, but I was just assuming, truthfully, that even with this injunction in place, the department was being able to move forward with the vetting process and really reviewing that. And you said that no, that injunction really has inhibited your efforts. I think the ranking member may want to jump into this, but can you explain in greater detail how that injunction is hampering your efforts of moving forward in terms of how do we properly vet refugees and other people coming in from those countries?
Yes, sir. We're just being as conservative as we can be, so that I don't, and frankly, with due respect to the Congress, I get an awful lot of phone calls and an awful lot of ugly phone calls about how I'm not following some law. I learned very early on, if there's a perception that we're not executing the law, then a lot of people get agitated and call. That said, we have moved forward, as I mentioned a little earlier, the State Department, some enhanced questions and et cetera, in terms of the normal visa process. In my case, looking very, very hard. And some of this is, by the way, a cultural change. Whether it's my people at CSIS or the consulate people, we are changing the culture to reflect the reality of security. That is to say, rather than the idea being bring in as many refugees as you can to meet some number set by the last administration, or bring in as many visas as you can, we actually now are changing the culture to say, look, if you want to come to America, you convince me you are who you are, and you're coming here for a period of time, and then you'll go home, and you won't do anything wrong when you're here. And, in the case of refugees, same thing. I know you're a refugee, but you got to prove to me who you are. and that you will come to the United States for all the right reasons. And ultimately, if you stay, then you'll assimilate into our society. But the kind of things, I think, the studies worldwide and the studies throughout the regions about what's the best way to do this, I think I'm restricted in that. But it doesn't mean we're not thinking about it.
From my standpoint, I don't want to feel you constrained. I don't want you restricted. Maybe Senator McCaskill's the same way. Maybe we can, at least lend that support from 2 U.S. senators.
Yeah, and I've looked briefly at the decisions, Secretary, and I don't see. I know the State Department's moving forward in terms of trying to prepare a report. And so clearly their lawyers are not seeing what your lawyers are seeing. So, and specifically in a couple of the orders, it's clear that you're not restricted in terms of moving forward, which with what I think your job is, regardless of a request by the executive to pause.
All right, everyone, we're going to cut out of this. We're going to take you live to the White House press briefing. It's starting momentarily. You can see John Roberts there on the screen practicing. Again, Sean Spicer coming up in just a moment. There.
Welcome, everyone, to the Fox 10 News Now stream. We are awaiting Sean Spicer to take the podium for the White House daily briefing. In other news here today that we have for you, a nonprofit issues group is labeling James Comey a political showboat in an advertisement set to air on television on Thursday, the day the former FBI director will be testifying on Capitol Hill. And folks, we will have a special stream as we do bring up that testimony. We'll have a special stream here for you, starting coverage 10 a.m. Eastern. Not going to want to miss that, folks. The ad by Great America Alliance is slated to run digitally on Wednesday and then appear the next day on CNN and Fox News. The narrator says in the 30-second spot that Comey put politics over protecting America. That spot was shared with the Associated Press. It accuses him of being consumed with election meddling, even as terror attacks were on the rise. The ads reflect a strategy by President Donald Trump and his advocates to question Comey's credibility. Comey will testify Thursday before the Senate Intelligence Committee and is expected to be grilled about his interactions with Trump ahead of his own firing. And cities are pushing back on the possibility of losing millions of dollars in U.S. anti-terrorism grants under President Donald Trump's spending plan, the third straight White House that has moved to cut the funding. The proposed budget would cut cash for the program from $605 million to nearly $449 million for the fiscal year beginning on October 1st and require cities such as New York, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas to pay 25% of the grants. The administration says it's proposing the cost share system similar to other grant programs to share accountability with states and cities. But lawmakers and local officials argue that reducing funding for the Urban Area Security Initiative would undercut efforts to maintain safe communities. Cities have spent the money on command centers, active shooter training, and personnel to patrol airports, transit hubs, and waterways. Big cities have been down this road before, with funding fluctuating over the years. President George W. Bush created the grant program after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, but scaled it back in his second term. President Barack Obama's proposed 2017 budget suggested slashing the funding from $600 million to $330 million. In each instance, local politicians reacted with outrage and questioned the wisdom of taking money away to fight against terrorism. This year, Congress ignored Obama's guidance and increased funding by $5 million. And Senate Judiciary Chairman Chuck Grassley is accusing the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs of lying about wait times for medical appointments at Iowa's VA hospitals based on documents provided by a whistleblower. The Iowa Republican said the data shows the agency provided false information to his committee in late February when it said no veterans had been waiting more than 90 days for care earlier this year at the two medical centers. According to the whistleblower data, which Grassley said the VA has since confirmed as accurate, the Iowa City VA reported 537 veterans waiting for a clinical appointment between 91 and 180 days. 539 between 181 days to a year, and 232 between 1 and 2 years. The other VA hospital in Des Moines show hundreds of others waiting for appointments more than 90 days. Grassley said the documents from mid-February show. I would draw the conclusion that they were misleading us because the information was probably embarrassing, he said in an interview yesterday with the Associated Press. It's a crime that veterans are being treated this way. The VA did not immediately respond to messages. And while we are waiting for Sean Spicer, we are also going to let you know that the State Department briefing will be going on simultaneously. So what we will do is after the conclusion of the Sean Spicer briefing, we will show you the State Department. And of course, if there's any breaking news in between, you know we have you covered. When it's breaking, we're streaming. And after the conclusion today of these briefings, I will also be talking about the anniversary of D-Day. That is today, and how we will never ever forget the amazing courage of those soldiers. June 6th, 1944, the Normandy landings. And I will be reading an article called D-Day, the Greatest Day of the 20th Century. That's coming up next on the Fox 10 News Now stream. And folks, an update on yesterday's big breaking news story out of Florida. The wife of one of the 5 victims of a workplace shooting at an awning company in Florida says her husband would give a person in need the shirt off his back. Janet Lawson said today on a fundraising website that her husband Kevin was the love of her life and the best husband and father imaginable. She says Kevin Lawson, who always would drop everything to help someone in need. Authorities say John Robert Newman Jr. shot and killed himself Monday after fatally shooting 5 of his ex-co-workers at a plant just outside of Orlando. And the company that owns that awning manufacturing plant where 5 workers were fatally shot by that ex-employee says they are heartbroken by this tragedy. The company on its website today asked of the public for thoughts and prayers for all the victims of the workplace shooting at the plant near Orlando in Orange County. The company is calling the shootings an unspeakable attack on our loved ones and employees. And in other news, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration is warning of a new problem presented by the nation's opioid addiction, the threat of law enforcement officers accidentally overdosing. The acting administrator said today that officers and emergency responders are increasingly coming in contact with potent synthetic opioids and crime scenes. He says accidental contact with these drugs can be lethal. Even very small amounts of drugs, such as fentanyl, can be deadly. The acting administrator warns officers who spot unknown substances to presume the very worst. And we were showing it to you right before this White House press briefing. Bum shot. Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly is defending top White House advisor Jared Kushner amid reports that Kushner attempted to establish a, quote, back channel communication between Russia and Donald Trump's presidential transitional team. Under Democratic questioning, Kelly said, "We have to make the assumption, and I will, that Jared Kushner is a great American." He said back channel talks have been common in U.S. actions. Still, Kelly noted the matter is under investigation by special counsel. And at least one Republican senator is dismissing the notion of President Donald Trump colluding with the Russians with a criticism of the president's dealings with his administration. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina has assailed Trump in the past and ran against him for the GOP presidential nomination. Graham was asked today whether he was concerned about the testimony from ousted FBI Director James Comey in Thursday's congressional hearing. Graham said, "I don't believe Trump colluded with the Russians because I don't think he colludes with his own staff, so I'm not worried about that." Thank you to all our viewers watching worldwide right now on the Fox 10 News Now stream. Just a reminder, Thursday, one of the biggest streams that we be able to offer you in the last couple of months here. We're going to have it live. Former FBI Director James Comey testifying. We'll have it without any interruptions, no commercials, just the raw stream. And as always, folks, we do encourage you to, why don't you just set that reminder now for yourself so you'll be the first ones to know when we start our coverage on June 8th, this Thursday, for former FBI Director James Comey testimony to the Senate Intelligence Committee. You can see there right on the top right corner of your screen the live stream event. Why don't you go to our events section and you can already set that reminder. And that way you'll get an alert when we are live and streaming live worldwide for you. And the Kremlin has denied claims from a U.S. government intelligence report that Russian hackers attacked at least one U.S. voting software supplier before last year's presidential election. The classified National Security Agency report was published online on Monday by The Intercept, said Russian military intelligence agency attacked the software company and sent spear-phishing emails to local election officials around October and November. And you just saw there, we did get the 2-minute warning, so we are now within 2 minutes from Sean Spicer hitting the podium here and starting up his White House press briefing. And the Associated Press just putting out breaking news right now that U.S.-led coalition strikes what it calls pro-government forces in Syria after they entered area near coalition base. That is from the Associated Press, and it is breaking right now. So maybe that could be one of the reasons why Sean Spicer a little bit late. He wants to get the very latest intelligence for the reporters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by taking a moment to recognize the more than 160,000 Allied troops who on this day in 1944 landed on the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of Allied soldiers lost their lives and thousands more were wounded during the fight to liberate Europe from Nazi control. We all owe the brave troops who were involved in this critical operation an enormous debt of gratitude for the freedom that we all enjoy today. Last night, the President was truly honored with the Vice President to host a reception and First Lady here at the White House to pledge our love, support, and undying gratitude to the Gold Star families who have experienced a similar sacrifice firsthand. The story of every brave man and woman who has paid the ultimate price, from the opening battles of our Revolutionary War to the ever-changing battlefields of today, is forever a part of our nation's proud history, and I hope everyone takes some time today to recognize the sacrifice that so many have made. Now, with respect to the schedule today, later this afternoon, the President will be hosting House and Senate leaders for a bicameral meeting to discuss his domestic policy agenda, specifically health care and tax reform. And later this evening, he will host a bicameral dinner of Republican members to discuss his recent overseas trip and the foreign policy challenges that he's ready to work with them to tackle. President Trump, as you know, has already signed in 36 individual bills into law, 14 under the Congressional Review Act. He passed the repeal and replace of Obamacare through the House, and the President has embarked on a historic first trip overseas, showing how quickly and decisively he's acting to rebuild America's standing in the world. And we've become the first administration since 1881 to confirm a Supreme Court justice within the first 100 days. Those are all things that I think will probably be discussed with some of these members of Congress today. And now that they're back from Memorial Day recess, we really look forward to carrying on with the agenda. On health care, as Sarah mentioned yesterday, we just don't have time to waste. Obamacare continues to collapse. I mentioned before, a third of the counties have only one provider on Obamacare. The average individual premiums have increased 105% on average from 2013 to 2017. And just today, Anthem, the only statewide insurer left in the state of Ohio, announced that it will be pulling out of every county's Obamacare exchange, leaving 19,000 Ohioans without any options. The American people have been saddled with the bill for Washington's inability to get this disaster taken care of, and it's simply not right for them to have to pay it any longer. It's time for us to provide them with the choice and control that all Americans want over their own health care. The American people and the American economy have often been suffering under a burdensome, overcomplicated tax system that stifles growth and takes too much money out of the pockets of working families. We're looking forward to working with Congress to change that by dramatically simplifying the system and delivering relief to middle income earners. Tax reform is a critical part of the President's agenda, and his team is working with a wide range of stakeholders, from legislators to business leaders to longtime tax policy experts, to ensure that his plan that Congress ends up taking on will make sure that it gets to his desk so he can finally fix the system. Later this afternoon, Director Cohn and Secretary Mnuchin will attend a listening session with business leaders from the transportation sector. This is one of about a dozen listening sessions that we plan to hold in the next couple months with job creators in different parts of the economy to hear about the reforms that would best allow them to thrive, expand, and create well-paying jobs for American workers. The Vice President is also meeting with legislators on the Hill today to discuss these next steps on all of the above policies. Elsewhere, the President's cabinet remains focused on acting his agenda in their departments and agencies. Secretary of Labor Acosta announced that the Department of Labor will strengthen its focus on preventing visa program abuse and take every available legal action against those who abuse the programs. This includes reporting cases of criminal fraud to the Office of Inspector General, establishing a working group to coordinate the enforcement activities to maximize efficiency, using all tools in conducting civil investigations to enforce protection for the American worker provided by the visa programs, and developing proposed changes to the current system to better identify violations and fraud and greater transparency. The President obviously was elected on a promise to prioritize the American worker, and his entire team here in the White House and throughout government is working hard in their respective areas to fulfill that. With that, I'd be glad to take a few questions. John.
Sean, moments ago, Mitch McConnell, who will be here in the next few minutes, reiterated that he is not a fan of the President's tweets. We understand, and you've explained several times, that the President likes to have this conduit where he can talk directly to the American people. But does he sometimes cross the line where his tweets become the news, become the agenda, and it actually impedes his ability to get things done?
Well, in the context of your question, I think you helped answer it. The President is the most effective messenger on his agenda, and I think his use of social media, he now has a collective total of close to 110 million people across different platforms, gives him an opportunity to speak straight to the American people, which has proved to be a very, very effective tool.
Using it and using it wisely can be two different things.
Right, and I think the same people who are critiquing his use of it now critiqued it during the election, and it turned out pretty well for him then. Blake.
Sean, let me ask you about health care. You mentioned the meetings that are taking place. Senator Lindsey Graham said the other day that he, quote, he was asked whether or not there will be Senate will be able to get a deal together. He said, I don't think there will be. Senator Burr said it's unlikely that we will get a health care deal. So are they just misinformed? What's the difference between what Republican leadership in the White House is putting out and what some Republican senators are saying? They don't think a deal is possible at some point this year.
Well, this is an opportunity. I think today the President's going to talk about that when he meets with the leadership, but they're going to work their will, and I think they're all going to come together. These, by and large, every elected Republican in the House and the Senate campaigned on this for the last 7 years, and I think that they will come together to make sure that they achieve the goals of lowering costs and providing greater access. But I know there's a commitment by the leadership and the committee chairs, and we remain very hopeful that it's going to get done.
Infrastructure, Chuck Schumer just a little while ago called the infrastructure plan an investment bank infrastructure plan, a Goldman Sachs plan. He said it is a sure loser here in Congress, his words. Are you guys willing to commit more than the $200 billion, the federal government, to potentially meet Democrats whenever a bill comes forward to try to get that across the finish line?
Well, look, I think the American worker and our infrastructure are the President's priority in this, putting people back to work, establishing, fixing those roads and bridges that allow our economy to thrive and grow. He's talked, the President that is, has talked about the impact of, broken bridges and bad roads have an impact on the economy and the ability to people to deliver goods to market. So he's going to create that public-private partnership that ensures that we maximize dollars that we put people back to work and get things done. And you saw that yesterday in the air traffic control proposal they put forward, where you had union support, you had bipartisan support, because the president's approach at this is that of a businessman, of understanding how you can utilize that public-private partnership to maximize dollars, put people back to work, and not just transfer federal dollars to state dollars, which doesn't really have the same economic impact, is really engaging the private sector in this.
And let me ask you one question about tax reform. Jamie Dimon said today, quoting from him, the urgency for tax reform cannot be overstated. Here we are in the early phases of June. Again, nothing concrete at this point. Where is the urgency at this point from the administration?
Well, again, that's a subject that's going to be discussed today with the leadership. It's something the president's talked about. As I just mentioned, Secretary Mnuchin and Director Cohen have been out talking to industry groups. We haven't had comprehensive tax reform since 1986. So it is something that is a big undertaking. When you're talking about the magnitude of this, both on the corporate side and on the individual side, and the impact that it's going to have on our economy and job creation, we need to get this right. We need to involve stakeholders from a variety of backgrounds to make sure that we get it right, and that's what the president and his team are doing. I want to talk to, someone asked the other day where our Skype folks are. I just want to make sure. David from Fox 29 in Philadelphia.
Sean, thank you so much for taking the time here. We really appreciate it here in Philadelphia and the greater Delaware Valley. We do have a question about the president's budget proposal, specifically the proposal to eliminate the deductions for local and state taxes, property taxes. In New Jersey, folks reportedly pay the highest amount of property taxes in the nation. There was a Quinnipiac poll that said 57% of folks surveyed do not support the proposal to get rid of those deductions. So the question is, what do you say to the folks who are worried they may take a major hit?
Well, David, thank you for asking. I think if you look at the principles outlined by Director Cohen and Secretary Mnuchin when they talked about the president's tax reform agenda, one of the principles was increasing the standard deduction. So for a middle-income family, you're talking about a doubling of that to $24,000. We estimate that about 95% of the folks that file now would not take individual deductions because of the large increase that would happen. Most middle-income Americans would actually save more under the president's plan because of the large increase that would exist with respect to the standard deduction. Blake, sorry.
Thanks, Sean. Just moments ago, the U.S.-led coalition announced that they've struck pro-Assad regime forces in southern Syria. Has the president been briefed on this situation?
He has.
And a quick follow-up question on the president's tweets. Are President Trump's tweets considered official White House statements?
Well, the president is the president of the United States, so they're considered official statements by the president of the United States.
If I can follow up on that question, is President Trump at all concerned that his tweets could be used against him at the level of the Supreme Court when the ACLU takes on this travel ban case?
Well, I think we've made it clear with respect to that that the court should follow the law, and I think the danger is real, the law is clear, and there's no question that we should prevail at the Supreme Court. Amen.
Thank you, Sean. Can you tell us where the president's going to be and what he's going to be doing on Thursday at 10 a.m.? Is he going to watch former Director Comey's testimony up on Capitol Hill?
The president's got a full day on Thursday. There's an infrastructure meeting with mayors and governors to talk about some of the projects that need to get out of that public-private partnership that I just discussed. He's giving a speech midday to the Faith and Freedom Coalition downtown. There's going to be a very busy day, as all of his days are. Look, as I just said, the president's going to have a very, very busy day, and as he does all the time, and I think his focus is going to be on pursuing the agenda.